on the plague and plunder, on the current moment. He wrote a great book. It's part of his dissertation. I think it's his most important book. He's known mostly for the boom and the bubble. But this book is entitled Merchants and Revolution. And it's about the origins of Lloyd's of London, as well as, the need for insurance in the merchant class after the Glorious Revolution in the 1640s. So an exceptional work, very good history of political economy, and I think it's a must-read in some ways, a very foundational text in how one would do radical political economy in a particular epoch. And as most of you know, this is the Hobbesian universe of possessive individualism. So I kind of think of that as a continuation of that work. So Merchants and Revolution. And I'll get you the names. There's a guy named Guevara. I forgot his first name. I think it's Alexander Gomez Guerrera, who's written on the insurance industry and actuarial tables, but I don't remember the title of the book, but it came out about 7-8 years ago. Very interesting attempt to look through the archive at the beginning of the insurance age and Leibniz's role in this with the principle of sufficient reason. So it's a very interesting, engagement there too. So we can go back to that. Capitalism and Arithmetic is Frank Sweck. I see the chat. I'm sorry. I've learned to do this with my students because all they do is chat in classes. But anyway, Capitalism and Arithmetic that Jeremy Glick just put in the chat, since we're on this thematic, is also worth reading, about the founding of the transition from the abacus to multiplication tables in Treviso, right, Bruno? Is that how you pronounce it? In Italy, right? Yeah. Did he leave for a second? Oh, he's here. Treviso, right? The Treviso arithmetic.
Yes.
Really the foundation of modern capitalism in terms of the mathematical model, since we spoke about that with Badiou last week. Yeah. So Capitalism and Arithmetic, the author is S.W.E.C.K. Frank Sweck. He also wrote a very seminal essay that's not known well called Pythagoras Chinese ? And a kind of interesting relationship to Chinese philosophy earlier, and how it may have influenced Greek mathematics. Yeah. And so anyway, we'll continue with this kind of underlying movement of Badiou on the mathematical ontology. I think this is again a very important part of Badiou's reading of Plato. And I wanted to mention this too. I know I throw out a lot of stuff, but I want to give you an idea of where Badiou is coming from on this mathematical ontology, at least in his own history. I mean, Badiou started out in terms of teaching. Louis Althusser asked Badiou to do courses on science in the 60s, and he did a book on numbers. And Badiou was really in the group of the Reading Capital group, if you want to think of the gang of five plus Althusser. And again, I'll repeat their names: Etienne Balibar, Jacques Rancière, Roger Establé, Pierre Macharet, and then Alain Badiou was on the periphery. So Badiou, of the five of them, was the one most interested in mathematics, mathematical ontology, and science, the philosophy of science, for lack of a better term, but really scientific reasoning and the history and philosophy of science. So he gave courses in that, and he became kind of the point person on this for the Althusserians. Now, there's a long tradition in France that goes back to 19th century with Poincaré and Évariste Galois in terms of the history of mathematics. Galois died in a duel. I think it's the cigarette family, if you remember. Galois made popular by Jean-Paul Belmondo and Breathless, that image of the cigarette smoke going up, and the lip, were really classic in film. But anyway, these two people were very influential French mathematics, and you go up to Pierre Duhem, who engaged German science. But during Vichy, there were two figures that are certainly worth knowing, and it's a tradition of the French intellectual history and philosophical history that is very underread in the United States. One of the persons is Jean Cavallet, Cavalles, Jean Cavallet, who wrote a book called The Theory of the Concept, the logic of the concept. And he was a mathematician, philosopher of mathematics. He died in the resistance. He was killed. He was known as the unknown soldier, number 5. Very close to Georges Canquillon, who wrote The Normal and the Pathological, and one of Foucault's major teachers and influencers, and also a very good friend of Althusser. Canquillon himself, I don't know, do you know the name Georges Canquillon? He wrote on The Normal and the Pathological, How Do We Come to This Language? Extremely influential on the work of Michel Foucault, especially the work on madness, history of madness, and mental illness and psychology. Canquillon also gave lectures on ideology and science. So anyway, these people were all in the resistance. Canquillon survived in the French resistance. Cavalles was killed, known as the unknown soldier number 5. He was also connected to the Bourbaki group. And I don't know if you know the story of Nicholas Bourbaki, but it was an invention of a Greek name of the person, but he had nothing to do with mathematics, but they called themselves the Bourbaki group. And one of the leaders of the Bourbaki group was a man named André Weil, who was Simone Weil, the philosopher's brother, and a very well-known mathematician. And another man named Jean Dieudonné, another person that we don't know about, but this was a very advanced group who basically thought of teaching mathematics theoretically, instead of formulaically or just learning how to do problems and equations. So the Bourbaki group became very, very influential in the 20th century in some circles. So they used some of Cavallet's principles, and they were known to Cavallet. They had collaboration. So they're another stake going on here. Badiou is very well aware of all these people. The other person is Albert Lotman, a book called Mathematics and the Physical Real. That's available in English. That has been translated. And Lotman also killed by the Gestapo in 1944. So you had two of the leading mathematicians, Jean Cavallet, The Dialectic of the Concept, and also, of course, Albert Lotman, who was doing work in theoretical mathematics throughout. So Badiou, in a strange way, I want to give you, in a sense, this complex anxiety of influence as well as this complex agglomeration of ideas that are figuring in this person, that he is in some ways obviously very influenced and very active reader of Sartre, right? Sartre of the communist period, the Marxist period, the critique of dialectic reason. And very, very active in that way, and a kind of continuer, if you will, of the totality and the totality of totalities that Sartre goes through in that book, and against serial thinking and this kind of positivist approach. This is number one influence, if you will, on Badiou. The reading both of Being and Nothingness as well as the critique, which is, actually, which Sartre considered his masterpiece along his Flaubert book. The other great influence, of course, is Lacan. And, we can, talk about that. Lacan comes up many times here. And, we have some people here, especially Richard, who knows the Lacanian tradition very well, and some of the, certainly the practice in the States and in France. So this is another thing. And, as Richard Leeds was saying last week, that the Lacan sort of went this way into the matheme. He thought that the unconscious could be formalized mathematically, so to speak. This was a kind of very ambitious project of his at the end. You know, maybe a megalomania, but you know that's another conversation we could certainly have. But this became the 19th, outside of Lacan, who was used in reading strategies, psychoanalysis, therapeutic situations. You know, the whole controversy around the short session. The use in film studies with Screen Magazine in Britain. But anyway, in this way, I mean, Badiou is very influenced by Lacan and an ongoing, dialogue too. And these are some of the hidden, since we're doing the Republic, and I've talked a little bit about the interlocutor. These are hidden interlocutors for Badiou, Sartre, Lacan, right? And then also, obviously, Marx. There's no question about that. And also these mathematicians, of which he really takes up seriously in terms of their ontology. And something, again, I think in the States, and I'm not an expert and I'm not trying to really, I just thought I'd attune us, if you will, to this practice of Badiou, that we are very, very among the left, except for Dirk Struett and a few other people, very under theorized on the left in terms of theory and history of mathematics. There are very few people who have read Jean Cavallet, Albert Lautmann, etc. In our circles, so to speak, much less teaching it, or the radical approach to mathematics in the schools, where theory and history is taught alongside of how to do it. So we really are the result in the era of computer science, programming languages, really about applied mathematics, not about theoretical and where's its role in all of this. So I just want to mention that because I don't think Badiou can be easily dismissed in terms of the classic division between poetic ontology and mathematical ontology. And maybe we'll see this. I mean, if you've gone ahead in the rewriting of the Republic or the overwriting of, the political community, as we're titling it, you will see there's a chapter on the dialectic of mathematics later on, which is, I think, very important to an understanding of Badiou once we get there. So that'll be probably in maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Today I want to do education, nutrition, all this stuff, musical, music as the base, musicos, musici as the base of the educational model. But again, I want to emphasize this, and anybody that really has the wherewithal or the ability to engage this, it would be very deeply appreciated on the left to go there. We don't have much of this going on. I know that Jeremy talks to Fred Moten often, and I know he's reading a lot of these histories. You want to give us a little short? And congratulations to Fred on a MacArthur Genius Award. Nobody deserved it more, to be called the genius, But any what he's doing with mathematics, can you let us know a little bit? You're mute. You got to learn how to push buttons. Yeah. Okay.
I'm trying to find it now. I know I sent it to Michael. Oh, yeah, here it is. There's I think he's from Medellin. No, that's Selma James. She's not from Medellin. I know. Oh, here it is. So Fred is engaged with this Colombian thinker named Fernando Zalamea.
Yeah, he's very good. History of mathematics, yes. Mm-hmm.
And I have like a boatload of this guy's stuff. I could try to figure out a way to get it to Michael.
Okay.
But he actually brought Zalamea to NYU.
How are you?
Give a seminar.
This battery is recharged.
Yep. To give a seminar on
what's going on with all the static. I'm sorry. I had a Zoom bombing this week too with a lot of racial stuff. Basically, I don't usually call the police, but I did when that happened in the chat. So yeah, go ahead, Jeremy. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, and I could get this to all you guys, but Fernando Zalamea, who I believe he lives in Medellin or Bogota. Synthetic philosophy of contemporary mathematics.
Right.
he came and he gave a seminar for 21 days in April at NYU. I guess Fred used his bursary money to bring this dude.
Right.
It was Peak Poetics, Walter Benjamin, and Higher Mathematics. This guy came from Medellin and gave a 21-day seminar on like Marxism, Benjamin, and mathematics. So I have I have like 6 of this dude's books. Some of them are in Spanish and some of them in English. And I think he's from either Medellin or Bogota. And the other thing I'll say, and I don't know much about it, but in the graduate program at Columbia this semester, Spivak is doing a seminar on mathematics and literature. Which
Don't get me started. Okay.
I know.
I'll be good. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, this dude Zalamea is like really big on the Colombian
right.
left, and he has all these really amazing books.
Yeah, Fred has the wherewithal. I'll say that. And he's got the currency too with the MacArthur as well. So yeah. Anyway, yeah. Who also knows a lot about jazz too. So yeah, good. Okay. So anyway, as you can see, this opens up a lot of broad topics, and it's just not so simple between the imitative, right, and the knowledge arts, if you want to put it that way, in Platonic terms. Poetry, the poiesis, the creative and the writing of poetry and the poet's role in the society are kind of excluded because of their imitative function, whereas the mathematicians, and as we cry, and we'll go to this next week with the allegory of the cave and the movement out of the cave into the world of mathematics, because without that, we are not in the world of knowledge for Plato. And I think Badiou really takes that seriously, that you have no episteme, you have no knowledge unless of the objectivity of the mathematical world, right? In a way. And those of you that know classical philosophy and the classics in a way, this is again is a dialogue that is going on, excuse me, between Pythagoras and Plato. This is basically somewhat the beginning of the real dialogue of philosophy. The mathematical and the poetic. And Plato, even though he writes poetically, it's clear that he really is trying to get to this level, if you will, of the objectivity of the mathematical inquiry. And that brings us back, and I want to point out 2 other things, and then I'll go on. Marx, some of you probably know, has manuscripts on the differential calculus that is available. I have a copy. I don't know if I could scan it, but I do have a copy of it if you're really interested. He wrote on the differential calculus and did a historical analysis of it too. And opened up that branch, if you will. And the person I mentioned is Dirk Struett, who actually lived to be 106 years old, was a professor in mathematics. I don't know if you know him, but he was an MIT, Norwegian in background, but spent most of his adult life in the United States teaching mathematics. And he wrote one of the best short history of mathematics. It's worth looking at too. I want to mention Struett. Struett also wrote on the whaling industry in the time of Melville, the time of Moby Dick, and the whole thing about the whaling culture of New England. So he's a very interesting figure in that way too. So Marx actually has this background in mathematics. So again, something that's not really talked about much. I know that some of you may know the work of Anwar Shaikh at the New School. Anwar Shaikh really thinks that capital can be, mathematized and is a predictive system, that we can actually predict its movements. So, and he has a whole group of mathematicians that have worked for him about 30 or 40 years, in terms of the laws of motion of capital. And this has been going on at the New School since the 1970s, when he was hired by Robert Heilbronner. So this is another interesting aspect along this general theme of mathematics, its relationship to philosophy, and then of course going back to Badiou. Badiou. And why mathematics? Why this with Badiou? This of course is purely intuition speaking, but Badiou may be looking in some ways at this new circuit of capital where we are. This may be something that could be work of the future to really figure out how derivatives work, right? What is this mathematics that has a stock market at almost all-time highs in the greatest, real economy depression we've had since the 1930s. This is a very interesting question to me. How is it that we have this massive disconnect? And this massive disconnect has gone on a very long time. What are the mathematics behind this? What are the algorithmic sequences, etc.? Why this valuation at this point as well? How is this really operating? So in some ways, maybe, and this is a big maybe, that Badiou is trying to go there without being explicit about it. At the same time, it's obviously the intellectual curiosity and the theory about the role of mathematics in not only everyday life, but as an ontology, as being, right, in a sense. And most of you kind of figure, God is, basically the spirit, the geometer in Descartes, in Newton, the clock, right? And then, in 20th century physics, the very elaborate theory of energy and the mathematical formula. So this is another thing too. Can energy be measured, mathematically? Is this where we are, ontologically speaking? So this is just some questions I throw out because I know we're going to have this discussion when we get to it. And let me just tell you the pages where he does this. This is a very fascinating part of this, and we'll get to it probably in 2 weeks. He has a section called From Mathematics to the Dialectic. So again, the dialectic is presupposed by mathematics in Badiou. So this is chapter 12 of the dialogue of the Badiou, From Mathematics to the Dialectic, and this is reflective of sections 521C to 541B. And what I will do at that time, and hold me to this, I'll do the divided line in terms of the theory of light, as a theory of light in Plato. The divided line is the ancient theory of light, which is taken up by the Arabs as well. So we got a lot to look forward to. There's a lot here. Whether you like these people or not, they at least provoke thought consistently and give us a lot to work with. All right. So the other thing I wanted to mention before we go back to the text is I did find in Capital, I wanted to give this too, on the social level. Marx in volume 1 of Capital, and this is in the section on the chapter on machinery, and I have it here, and I actually wrote it out because I'm going to use it. From chapter 14, which of course in Capital is the division of labor and manufacture, and a very beautiful chapter to read because there are many metaphors of the hand and the handicraft. I think this is Marx in terms of the making, the hand. What the Germans say, begriffen, to conceptualize means you're taking from the hand. And anyway, he speaks on the abundance of use values, and this is on pages 487 to 489 of first volume of Capital. And I'm just going to read you what he said. This standpoint, the standpoint of use value, is adopted by Plato. And then I jump to the footnote. With Plato, the division of labor within the community develops from the many-sidedness of the needs of individuals, are kind of multitasking, and the one-sidedness of their capabilities. And I know Edwin is here today when we talked a little bit about social mobility, and Marx is talking about this, that there's very little mobility in terms of the worker in Plato. The main point with him is that the laborer must adapt himself to the work, not the work to the laborer. A thing which would be unavoidable if the laborer carried on several trades or practices at once, thus making one or the other subordinate. Kind of how we multitask today. We don't really have that concentrated one moment going on. So anyway, at times, who treats the division of labor as the foundation on which the division of society gets into estates, right? And it's based on, and also this is talked about by Xenophon, who was characteristic bourgeois instinct. So Marx goes back to Xenophon, the historian, and says who has a consistent bourgeois instinct, insistent or instinct that it already comes closer to the division of labor within the workshop. So this is all being, looked at by Marx. And then Marx says Plato's Republic, or the political community, insofar as the division of labor is treated in it as the formative principle of the state, the division of labor, is merely an Athenian idealization of the Egyptian caste system. Egypt, having served as the model of an industrialist country, to its other contemporary ones, right? And this is coming from Marx, again, as the great classicist as he was, and this is a kind of footnote, is reading Isocrates on the Egyptians here. Isocrates is one of the founders of rhetoric, right? One of the great founders of rhetoric. Yeah, in a way. Okay. So anyway, and this is taken from Boussardus's that labor is divided into special tasks. This talks about the specialist with a hand, the handicraft, and all of that. So I wanted to mention that this is Marx. Marx has very few engagements with Plato in Capital, and maybe earlier. And the tradition is always, once again, and we talked about this the first week. The tradition has always had him as an idealist, right? Plato is an idea. You don't have the bed as a material that becomes a form, that has a use, and then ultimately has an ultimate purpose, as Aristotle would have it in terms of the four causes. For Plato, the idea is always first, right? We come to things through ideas. We don't come to ideas through things. And this is a very elementary thing of of reflection that's been going on in the tradition for a lot of things. James Joyce, for example, at least in my understanding of Joyce as a writer, came to things through words. You already had the words, right? Most people see the thing and they identify it. The pointing to, as in Wittgenstein, there are many, many levels here that I think you can operate with. But Marx, again, the Marxist tradition has always looked at Plato, quote unquote, as an idealist, and we'll go there too when we get more to the cave and going back in the cave. And Badiou has a whole section on what is an idea. So I'm prefacing again, what we're building towards. We're going to ask really the question, what is an idea? As we move forward too. So this is going to be, I think, a lot of fun to do that. So anyway, I wanted to share that from Marx, that Plato, in a way, is the first to really presuppose and engage the division of labor. Really, in a way. And this is where, I know he came up last week, Jacques Rancière begins in his book, The Philosopher and His Poor. Right? He begins with the division that Plato himself is the father of sociology. This is in a book called The Philosophy and His Poor. And that because of this division of labor and the division of needs. And he goes through this very actively in the first chapter of the book. And I have it here, actually. This is called The Philosopher and His Poor, right? And it's the first chapter on the order of the city, which is a reading of early Plato. Very, very interesting, moment here, right? As the division of labor. Yeah. And so I recommend this as a very nice introduction, if you will, to the Plato's political community. So, again, this is a thing that's, I think, again, that Marx poses this question about the division of labor, and we can go back there. And I know Edwin, who's here today, asked this question about that there's very little mobility. Yes, each according to his place, each according to his craft is part of the Platonic universe, right? Which is interesting, right? And this is, again, can be taken in different ways vis-a-vis, modern, communist regimes, if you want to look at it that way. Was that part of the assignment of place and function, right? Is this always a criticism that was operative, or is this something that we can really work with and overcome and think through in a different way? This lack of social mobility, right, in certain regimes. What happens here? Yeah. Okay, so we can speak about this. Also, of course, Lukács's criticism, as well as Gramsci, of education is based on this over specialization too. That everybody is only good in their various specialties, and the general approach no longer is there. The generalist is no longer there in education, or one is not really formed as a whole person. One is formed as a part, for the society. The slogan: "Find your niche, find your place in the society." So this is another aspect that we can engage. Okay. So any thoughts? I know it's been a long thing about from mathematics back here, and Jeremy's putting George Jackson balancing love. Yes. Well, we'll get into love. Yes. Yeah. Right. And Nathan wanted to talk as an act of love. Yes, I would hope so. Building a bed is an act of love. Yeah. Sometimes better than the road, right, or the floor. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So, any questions or thoughts before we go? I want to go back to the educational mix here. Yeah.
Could I ask a quick question about math? Yeah, because it was quite some time ago. I was reading A Difference in Repetition. There's quite a whole chapter on the theory of calculus, which I didn't understand at all, and I was wondering if Badiou has any response to Deleuze's approach to the theory of calculus, because I think in difference repetition he plays on differentiality and difference and integration, and how the function, the mathematical function generates its own discrete series, and that has something to do with his metaphysics. So I'm just wondering if Badiou has anything to say about.
Want me to do another course for about 15 weeks on this? I mean, this is a very loaded question.
It's crazy.
Sorry. I can't. But yes, I can tell you Badiou engages Deleuze on this, and I can tell you where he engages it, in terms of location. To get into a discussion about that would require a major, and one that we'd all have to bone up on, a lot. So anyway, Badiou responds to this in both Being an Event and Logics of Worlds, and in both of his ontologies. I want to say the controversy, I mentioned this person in the beginning, and I can show you, I think I have the book around here somewhere. I did. I don't know what I did with it. I was looking at it the other day. Mathematics in the Physical Real by Albert Lautmann, the mathematician, the person that was, killed by the Gestapo in 1944. The other one is Cavalet. And again, these are two central figures, going back to where we began tonight, in the history of French thinking about mathematics. Right? And this is where the argument is about Lautmann and how to take Lautmann up. When you bring up series, Deleuze has written a book called The Logic of Sense, in which he opens up the Stoic approach to logic, the Stoic logic, in which series and serial thinking is taken on. So this is another place where he engages this. Difference in repetition, to me, again, would require a long seminar, unfortunately. Part of the problems with the graduate schools, and it took me many years to realize this, but it overindulges everybody with all this high-powered theory without, the slowness in the background that's really necessary to understand what does Deleuze mean by difference. Where is he getting this from? Just in the title alone is a class, right? Going back to the difference between the Fichtean and Schellian systems of knowledge, of knowing, that's in Hegel, as well as repetition. Is it Kierkegaardian? Is it Lacanian repetition? Is it Nietzschean repetition? Is it the repetition that Marx speaks about historically? So all of these factors are going in terms of the development of this kind of thought. So, I mean, I just want to point that out. I know you're very curious and enthusiastic. You know, you have what Kant calls the enthusiasm and all that. But, take it slow because it'll come better. You know, it's and these are part and parcels of real interlocution going on between these people. You know, they knew each other. They were writing both for and against each other throughout this period. There are polemics happening here, and to know how to situate those polemics are very important. Yeah, and yeah. So So I think this is, again, important. You know, we talk about Deleuze. Deleuze is both for and against Lacan. You have to understand what part is he against in Lacan and what part is he for, right? Going forward. So I think this is, again, important. And what we learn from Plato is we have this cast of characters. I mean, this is what I get from rereading this, at least on a very primary level. We have this cast of characters, such as Meno, such as Lacan in the Republic, such as, Polymarchus, Thrasymachus, all the characters, and Crito, of course, the Euthyphro, all of these characters who are doing the same thing, who keep reappearing and their ideas keep reappearing in the Platonic universe. So I think this is, again, something we keep in mind. So I can't answer your question because I'm really not capable, in 15 minutes we require. But I will promise you I will look at it. I have a difference in repetition here, and I'll look at it and look at the section. But again, it is about, and you will see, Deleuze will mention Albert Laudman. This is a name I'd like people to, kind of learn vis-a-vis Badiou, right? And when we get to this thing of mathematical, I don't know if he mentions Laudman. Let me just see. I don't know if he mentions Laudman. I don't remember in the mathematical thing, but in the discussion, because sometimes you make a lot of modern moments. But this is really about the passage, right? The great turnaround. I don't think he mentions Laudman in this book, but all over being an event and logics of worlds, right? In a way, yeah. Okay, so I mean, when I began this course, I said, all of philosophy, as Whitehead said, is a mere footnote to Plato. I don't mean that as the eternal truth. I mean that in terms of thematics, right? And some of the things we still deal with today. That's all. I think that's what Whitehead meant by that. Not that the eternal truths are all in Plato, like some people did. Yeah, the clamor of being is his engagement, as Bruno just put in the chat. Yeah. And so was Etienne Balibar's father, I think, was a mathematician as well. So they have that history, right? So, yeah. So, okay. So let's go back to the text, if you don't mind. I wanted to go back, return to the section in Badiou. And in the Republic, I want to mention a couple of passages. First, in the Republic itself, in Plato's Republic, I'm using the Reeve translation. I have more notes in that than in the Rosen. But anyway, this is on line in Book 2, returning to Book 2 in a sense, about what the guardians have to have, right? And this is on. I'm going to give you the pagination in the Greek. This is it's on page 56 of Book 2 of the Reeve translation, and it's in 370. I have very bad light. I'm sorry about that. 376. Excuse me. D and E. Okay. So Socrates says, philosophy, then, and spirit and speed and strength as well, must all be combined in the nature of anyone. This is the guardian class being formed, right? The guardian, who is going to be a really fine and good guardian of our city, right? Number one. So the guardian class that is to be educated by the philosopher kings, right, is going to have spirit, the second part of the soul, as I've spoken about, that recognition, etc., that's going on. Speed and strength, right? As well, must all be combined in the nature of anyone who is going to be a really fine and good guardian of our city. Absolutely, replies Glaucon. Then this is why we would have to be like at the outset. But how are we to bring these people up and educate them? So this is the question, and again, in a dialogue, and you can think of, how things go on in academia. What are we going to teach the kids? How are we going to adjust the things? This is, kind of prefacing all of this, but it's more, it's denser here, I think, in a lot of ways. Will inquiring into that topic bring us any closer to the goal of our inquiry, which is to discover, again, the origins of justice and its instrumentality? And if you remember, the overarching question is still, what is justice, and is it instrumental or not, right? An injustice in the city. We want our account to be adequate, but we do not want it to be any longer than necessary. So he doesn't want to keep you too long in school, so to speak, is the way, but it wants to be firm and decisive. Okay, I, for one, certainly expect this inquiry will help us. By Zeus, my dear Adimantus, we must not abandon it, even if it turns out to be a somewhat lengthy affair. No, we must not. So basically, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4 are all addressing the question here. How do we educate the populace? How do we make this guardian class, right? Okay. And I want to just say, I see in the chat, in case you didn't, I guess you saw it, Hugo mentioned Odysseus, the bed of Odysseus and Penelope, right? And the Greek word nostos means the return home. It's not nostalgia so much. Nostos, from which our word nostalgia comes from, is really the Odyssean journey home, the Odyssey home. And as Camus very rightly pointed out, Odysseus had a choice. Calypso offered him immortality or a return home, and he chose the way home. So he chose home. So the Greeks were very much about this nostos, the home, right, in many ways, and it may be a creative nostalgia, but we can go back to that. Okay, so come on then, and like people as a fable, telling stories at the leisure, let us, in our discussion, educate these men, right? So again, this is to create this class called the guardian class, and we can think about this as a professional class today. Again, I repeat the three elements here of the soul, the appetitive, the spiritual, and the rational. The idea is to take the appetitive and change it more and more into the rational and the spiritual. This is always going on, right? In the Platonic universe, right? And the guardians who will guard in some ways are kind of like the educational police and the censors that are protecting above the philosopher kings who have no material benefits, just enough to live on, the yearly grants or whatever. Then the guardian class, who are the educators at one level, and also the police, the auxiliaries there, and then at the bottom, and there are many orders of rank here that go beyond the three, and we can go through those too. But the third order here is the craftspeople and the artisans, and as we've spoken about, Socrates comes from an artisan class, and Socrates' background in terms of mythology, one of the patron saints of Socrates is Daedalus, who is a craftsperson, a maker. He's a man of the hands. He's a manufacturer, if you will. He makes by the hand in the Latin etymological, background to manufacturing. He makes by the hand. Yeah. So his mother, of course, is the midwife. So this is very interesting. Once again, you have these two things going on at once: conceptualization and the birth of ideas, right? Together. The delivery of the ideas. So, what then will the education be like? And this is crucial because this sets up the next 2-3 books, and we're going to go to Badiou on this as well. What then will the education be? Or is it difficult to find a better one that has been discovered over a long period of time? And these are the two moments: physical training, the disciplines of the body, and the musical training for the soul. And musical training involves poetry, narrative, right, as well as the learning of music, right? It's not only music, right? It's also the telling of stories, the epic poetry. As most of you know, Aristotle sets up in the Poetics a distinction between the epic poem and the lyrical. In a way, Homer and Sappho, of course, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Bruno, you want to talk about the philosophical character of dogs? That's good. That kind of presupposes, prefigures this. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I
It's
mean, I
right
just,
before in Plato, the philosophical
yeah,
character of the dog, right?
right. Yeah,
So,
I just find it wonderful because to
yeah,
me it's really
yeah,
a
yeah,
perfect example of individuation, right? It's really that's the point being made. I believe it's
right.
a precise, very singularity and individuation in that sense, right? So I mean,
Yes. Is
uh,
that when a dog sees someone it does not know, it gets angry even before anything had happened to it. But when it knows something, it welcomes him, has never received anything good from him. Have you ever wondered at that? I never paid any attention, said
yeah.
Glaucon, until now. But it's clear that a dog does that sort of thing. Well, that seems to be a naturally refined quality and one that is truly philosophical. In what way? In that it judges anything it seems to be either a friend or an enemy on no other basis than it knows the one and does not know the other. And how could it be anything besides a lover of learning, if that would define it as its own and what is alien to it in terms of knowledge and ignorance? He asks the question. It certainly could be. So this is where we go on, but surely the love of learning and philosophy are the same, are they not? Yes, they are the same. Then we can confidently assume that the same holds for a human being too, if he's going to be gentle to his own and those he knows, he must be by nature a lover of learning and philosophy. And there's the concept of the philosophos is really the lover of learning, right? And in a way, this is really the definition of the philosopher, the one who has intellectual curiosity. And I want to throw that out, with all due reverence to Bernard Stiegler, etc. We have lost. Not only in this proletarianization of the world, we have lost this ability for intellectual curiosity. This is really what's going on at this point in the educational sphere, to my mind. This is one of the great lacks and one of the great losses that we're facing as professors and as teachers and as we go forward, right? I'm just looking again at the level of this Supreme Court hearing. Already the Democrats have given in. I don't know if you know, they're now saying she did wonderfully, all this kind of nonsense. Like a big surprise, after Joe Biden is going to say if he gets elected, and it's an if still, why can't we be friends, right? I hear the songs, right? Yeah. Yeah, why can't we be friends, etc. This kind of unity kumbaya moment where we're already getting it prefigured in this Supreme Court hearing, right, in a way. To me, the way they get away with this constantly is there's a total lack of intellectual curiosity. There are very, very few people who can critically analyze that this person is a trained dog in the law, right, to evade every serious question, to be able to take a position, deflect it, right, etc. No one has pointed out that strategy or the methodology at work here. What she's done in this court hearing. I mean, I'm stupid enough to spend my time, my good time, limited time on earth, actually watching part of this to see how it unfolds. But what I notice here is, again, this kind of, what Stiegler has called, knowledge and stupidity in the 21st century. We are becoming dumber and dumber because of this lack of what Bruno points out, the intellectual curiosity, that is prefaced by the dog.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
Michael, if I may, no, because
Yeah, sure.
especially because we are reading these pages on education and mentioning Stiegler,
Yes.
and he does say in, I believe, State of Shock, right, that
Yes.
there is this idea. I mean, when he speaks about the Deleuze and Derrida vis-a-vis the question of the animal, right?
Yes.
That precisely the animal is not stupid. I mean, the non-human animal cannot be stupid. It is
Right.
only the human animal ourselves. And so that's why then the question of education, right, becomes so important here, whereas the singularity and the individuation of the intuition, right, because then knowledge begins with intuition of the dog, in this example, is enough, is sufficient to even avoid the possibility, the danger of stupidity.
Right, exactly, yeah. And then you see this also in The Ring, the double moment of The Ring. This kind of filmic quality of The Ring of the Jinzes, that we went over a little bit last time. Yeah? We also have it there too. The invisible and the visible, playing out constantly on the two front and back of the ring, the recto and the verso. The double reading, if you will, the double game always of reading too, is also here. So yeah, I think you make a great point about education, right? And animals have figured in education too. In Kant, it's the sheep that are used, right? Yeah, the herd. In Nietzsche as well, the herd mentality, the crowd, as the herd, right? And
the herd immunity comes.
And now we have herd immunity, right, playing out today. So anyway, I wanted to show that this is being set up, that the guardian class is not only, it must have speed and strength. And I think we should think about this too. Again, the speed and strength of that is incorporated here, and of course, physical training and how important that is to the political community in Plato, and then of course for Badiou as well. So I thought we would go on to that too. So anyway, we talked a lot about. I don't think we have to go over this again. The use of the epic poetry and book 2 on guardian education, but then he's going to go into in book 3, this music as the basis. So maybe we can begin there. Any thoughts about that? What Plato's really up to and how Badiou works with this too? I mean, there's a lot about music here, both not only as a basis of the education, music, right, as one of the bases, but also its effects. Why? Why is that so necessary? He speaks about the effects of music, mathematical training at the base, right, of education. Any thoughts about that as we go on? And yeah. Anybody? Yeah. I mean, Badiou calls it literature and music, disciplines of the mind, if you want to go to the more contemporary text. And this is his reading of 376, where I started going forward. Badiou, this is happening after the young people's, further into his text. I'm going to go back to justice next week. But the disciplines of the mind. And so this is on page 64, it begins. And this is Badiou's reading of books 2, the end of book 2, book 3, and book 4. So any thoughts about that? About music at the base? Why? Yeah? Or what you got out of the thing? Yeah? The crucial question that is posed in the beginning of the dialogue in chapter 4 for Badiou. What are the conditions under which justice and injustice emerge in the body politic or in the political community? What are the conditions? So this is where the discussion begins, right? Right? And then they speak about the supervision of the storytellers. Supervision. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, Beryl, you wanted to say something? I'm sorry. I see in the chat. I missed your hand. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the book too. I'm sorry. Did you please? Yeah, go ahead.
She's muted.
Oh, she's muted. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to speak? I'm sorry. Oh no. Okay. I saw on the thing. Okay. All right. So, all right. So, but any thoughts about this? I mean, I can go straight to the music thing too. No one want the noble lie, the true lie, is also engaged here too, in which we're going to speak more about the noble lie, and of course we talked last week about eugenics and the mixing of the metals, because the myth of the metals and the class structure is going on simultaneously in Plato. The mixture of gold, silver, right, which is okay, but gold and bronze is not so good, right? And gold going to bronze is almost forbidden, right? So you can see a kind of internal, racism happening here too. Okay, so anyway, but let's go ahead here too. What about this section 79? Fits of madness and ignorance. This is page 78 in Badiou. And again, madness and ignorance are purely human affections, objected to Mantha, right? About lies, truth, lying. Okay.
Sorry, Michael. I'm sorry to bother, but which notebook
I'm in the
is?
Badiou. I'm sorry.
I am that one, but I'm reading the French one, and so just.
Oh, I don't have the French with me.
But
just the French is nearer you than me right now.
Is
My French copy is near you.
Is the third one? Is the third one?
It's the fourth chapter, and it's about 7 or 8 paragraphs in. The chapter would be in French the esprit et discipline, right?
Literature and music. That's right. That's good.
Music.
Yeah.
Oui.
Thank you.
So, okay, so then, yeah. So, and this is about 8 pages in, and he's going on. He's really speaking about being deceived and the noble lie and the repetition of the lie. So anyway, I'm gonna go back up on the page of 78. To be absolutely precise, what I call the true lie is in fact real ignorance. Okay, so this is interesting. The ignorance of the deceived person just when he thinks he's inwardly becoming the subject of which he is capable of. The lie in speech merely imitates that real subjective affection and produces a derivative image of it, which is exactly a pure lie. Only the true lie, considered as a disorder of the subject, incurs not only the god's hatred, but man's as well. Okay, I understand it now. This is about the big lie, right? How one is deceived. The case of the lie in speech, that pale copy of the true lie, remains to be dealt with. There are some situations in which, unlike the true lie, the lie in speech doesn't deserve to be hated, such as when it's addressed to enemies or so-called friends whom a fit of madness or some extremely serious misunderstanding has incited to betray it or play some dirty trick on us. Lying words can, in those cases, act as a remedy. And here's the notion of the pharmacon at work, right? To correct the suspicious intentions of such people. The double game of reading, remedy and poison, the double session in Derrida's dissemination. Another example, which we are discussing a little while later, is that of the myths. Since we don't know what the true circumstances were, inasmuch as they are lost in the mists of time, we can make up legends in which those circumstances are as much like their concealed truth as possible, and thereby perform a useful service by lying. This is very interesting because he's really going through myths and storytelling and how lies are generated and then repeated, right? So Amantha objects, but fits of madness and ignorance are purely human affections, objected Amantha. There's nothing in what you are saying that would allow the gods to lie, or at least not in what we mean by God as the symbol of a humanity that has achieved its infinite perfection. Okay? So we have this working definition of the infinite perfection, achievement. You're absolutely right. God, as I'm in the habit of saying, following Jacques Lacan, is just the nickname of the big other. That's kind of interesting, right? The big other, the nickname is God. So, when you get around religious people, maybe we could talk to Amy Comey Bryant about that, the big other instead of God. In other words, the repository of all things worthy of being exalted in any one you might chance to encounter. That being the case, we can say that no lying poet haunts the divinity. Really, said Glaucon, was obsessed with the frivolous tales of sexual infidelity that mythology abounds in. So there's nothing that the gods can lie about. If God is the other, the guarantor of all speech, absolutely nothing. And this really opens up the question of what is truth, right? What is truth? And it opens up the question of, in German, Wahrheit, right? Vérité in French, right? It opens up the question versus that of the Heideggerian notion of ultimately there is no truth, there's only veiling and unveiling. That aletheia is the interpretive device that will get us much closer to the truth and to the originative emergence of something, okay? In whatever we're reading. I hope I'm doing this okay. So whatever in a subject is related to his spiritual divine nature, thus conceived as alien to lying, ad Socrates. The only thing that can be called God, that is to say, the pure essence of the other, big other, whether it exists or not is another story, is a symbolic being, perfectly simple and true in both word and deed, which neither changes itself into something else nor deceives others with trickery, such as visions, misleading words, or fake signs. And that's the case regardless of whether you're awake or you're dreaming. And he gets in. I mean, the thing about Badiou, he's very important. He's very well read in the history of philosophy, to put it mildly. This is a look at Cartesian thinking, right, about representation. You know, there's no really essential difference between sleeping and waking in terms of representation. We have the same representational things, imitative functions in our dream world as we do in the waking sense. So he's actually playing upon this. He's bringing in this Cartesian moment. Also, he's also in the cave, too, in terms of shadows, reflections, images of physical objects. I mean, I can do this very, very simplistically, and I'll diagram this for you. Maybe I can go to a blackboard and just get it on YouTube and then refer. But anyway, if you think of the divided line, you think of a vertical line and a horizontal line, right? And then at the top is the movement to the good, and at the bottom is the cave. And you have sections. You begin at, A at the bottom, then B, and then C is the middle, where the so-called divided line is. This is book 6 of Plato's Republic, and Badiou will go through this in one of his chapters. But if you think of this kind of diagrammatically, you begin to see that the Platonic universe itself is constructed on, two sources of light, right, in a way. On the one side, underneath line C, underneath the divided line, is the sun, the world of natural light, the light of the star of our system, of our solar system. This governs and regulates everything, and it is really about the order of sensibility, the senses, the world of the senses, and regulates our sense perception and the order of the sensible. This is the world of appearance. And you have many, many levels of perception here. So you have a source of the perception. Below the line is the sun as the source. Above the line would be the good, to agathon, right? Or the good. And the good is the governor of everything that is part of the intelligible order. So you have two orders, if you will, the sensible below the line, of which our senses dominate. We're dominated by our, sense perceptions, right? The governor is the sun. And as you go across the line, you have both the things perceived, the modes of perception, and then ultimately the classes of perception, how we classify perception. So let me see if I can do this verbally, and then maybe we can figure out a way to, diagram it fully. So the light beneath in the cave, and to the top of the cave, the first emergence out of the cave into the, quote, true versus the false, if you will, in the world of appearance, is really generated by the sun. That's the theory of light, a kind of natural light that we see, right? In a way, right? and this is being governed again by the sun. But the prisoner who escapes in the cave to get to the opening there is still in the world of appearance, in the world of the appearance of things, not into the world of reality, because the world of reality presupposes, again, this world of abstraction. We have to cross the line from our sensible order into the intelligible order. Yeah? So this turnaround has to happen. Same thing happens in the world of things. We get the images of physical objects, the bed, as Hugo has this very nice thing on the Odysseus and about the idea of the bed and the building of the bed, etc., is part of that world of the images of physical things and actually refers then to the next level physical things before you get out of the cave. But as you turn at the divided line, at line C, into D, you begin to see mathematical objects, which are presupposed on mathematical hypotheses, and music proceeds this way. How do we organize sound? How do we do so by number? How do we do through arithmos, etc.? So we're moving, from the things perceived by the senses, then to the intelligible order of things, which is really mathematical objects presupposed by hypotheses. From there, we go to something called the forms. And the forms in Plato are really generated from the mathematical objects up towards the good. So we begin to talk about such things as justice, beauty, excellence, virtue, all these concepts, etc. This is happening in the world of reality, in the intelligible order, the world, if you will, of the intellect, right? Okay, so that's the second, if you will, vertical axis, right? That's also on the horizontal plane that you're moving up from, the cave towards the light of the good, the other light, the light of abstraction, etc. Okay? Yeah. Oh, okay. You have it. Oh, it's dark. Oh, thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. Okay. And then we have the actual, not only the things perceived, but the modes of perception. How do we perceive? What modes do we go through? So in the cave, it's by shadows, by reflections, by images, right? We're dominated by that in the cave. I mean, the screen New Deal, if you will, to play on a phrase of Naomi Klein, or our domination by the screen in today's world, right? The dependence on Zoom, etc. This kind of cave-like, reflections, word, deed, etc. that's given to us by these electronic lights and, connection and G5 and all this stuff. But anyway, so the images, right, and this is generated by the of the imagination. This is the world of imagination or the world of supposition. And from this world of supposition, we go to the next level, which is really that of belief. How are beliefs formed? Through supposition in the world of imagination. So this is very interesting in terms of the modes, how we work through these modes. We cross the line, again, we get into what's called understanding for Plato. We begin to grasp things in a different way once we cross the line, and we begin to go into the next world, which is much closer to the world of the good, right? In this world of reality above the line, into reason and then dialectic. And we're going to see this in the Badiou when we talk about from mathematics to the dialectic, right? And so this is the next step, the modes. Then the classes, and this is very interesting too, and I think this is also about where we are with so-called democracy, and Bruno made a good point, democracy is impossible under capitalism, but what democracy has kind of purported in capitalism is another thing. On the bottom, in the cave, we are ruled by doxa, by opinion. D-O-X-A. We're ruled by opinion. They're right and wrong opinions. By the way, if you're interested in this, the dialogue, the Meno, again, which I like very much, also in the Euthyphro to a degree. And somewhat in the Apology, Socrates will talk about the difference between right and wrong opinion, and this is part of the dialogue that's always going on. Without the right opinion, you have no way out of the cave into the next step to understanding, or you have no way towards knowledge. You can live in a world completely of ignorance and wrong opinion. So he speaks to this as well. So for Badiou, and I certainly agree with this in so many ways, if we go back to, Lippmann, Edward Bernays, and all these people, the democracy has become the management of opinions. This is what we get on a daily dosage, a kind of management of opinions, recirculation of opinions with very little knowledge at all. We have not really gotten out of that step. So part of the task in, quote, education is to put people on the path of right opinion so that they may come closer to episteme or to knowledge. So these are the classes of perception, how we perceive, and this is a basic diagram of the theory of ideas or the theory of how forms are generated. So without mathematics, Plato does not put poetry for Plato, and we'll go back to this for Plato, not especially only for Badiou, but certainly in Plato, it's pretty clear that the poets, even though the great irony is he writes like a poet, he is a poet in his way, that the poets are part of the imitative arts, which still are below the cave, or in the cave. They only work with imagination, supposition, play with shadows and reflections, only deal with affects, not with knowledge, right, of this. So affects and opinions are all below the line. I mean, and again, I think this is a theory of light. How do we cast the light on something? How do we see? Again, the eidetic, the eidos. How is this really happening to us? How do we get to this level of the good? How do we get to these levels of abstraction? So this is a very early model of how we abstract in the world versus that of, straight out empirical sense perception knowledge and, into the kind of theoretical realm. So I don't know, any thoughts about I hope, and Josh sent the link. I think thank you, Josh, really a lot. Yeah, I don't remember exactly when did that, but I think I did a pretty elaborate diagram, if I remember, of this that you can certainly access. But I think it would help, in terms of understanding what Plato is about in terms of his epistemology and the generation of forms. Yeah, Bruno. Yeah.
No, Michael, I like what you say very much, and I agree. So the question of imitation and the imitation of the imitation, right? It's important. I mean, the question, the danger, right, that they see in taking the right path or the wrong path in education has to do precisely with this question of not that you present of the epistemology and therefore the path to knowledge, or the possibility, the danger of missing that path altogether. Right. Well, so the question, because at one point they will say, at least here, I can tell you where it's 395. Maybe we haven't gotten there yet.
You or the thing. I mean, maybe we should for purposes refer Badiou versus Plato,
yeah,
right?
No, I know, but I had a comment or question about that as well. I'm still trying. Probably we all are to understand really the place. The important shift that we find in Badiou, right, in relation precisely to education and the construction, therefore, of the right, or whatever, the construction of the world in which we live, right, the world of opinion for Plato, the real world, right, for us. Right. So it's interesting. So the way in which, if I may, this is maybe, a bit, but parenthetically, that I'm reading also Dante, the comedy. And last night I found,
which one?
From Purgatorio.
Okay, you're there now. You got out of Inferno.
Yeah, we are there. Yeah, but in Canto 17, if anybody wants to see this line from line, I'm not going to read that. From line 70 to the end of the Canto, a wonderful philosophical reflection on the ethics of love and desire. Not love in the romantic sense, love in the sense of, love, the curiosity, intellectual curiosity,
Right.
and desire, and how the objects that we love
Yeah.
may be the right one, and therefore we take the right path, or the wrong one, and therefore we take the wrong path.
Yeah, I mean, I want the Greeks to correct me, but I'm thinking out loud here that we have the philo, which is the lover, right, and the philosophos of the intellectual curiosity. We have the erotic lover, and we have the spiritual lover, the agathos. I mean, or the agape, from which the spiritual love. So we have agape, eros, and philos, right? Philia. Right? Okay, so 3 types of love, at least to begin with, right? Stendhal does more with this, but I like the way we're going about this.
Yeah, so in any case, I mean, I just wanted to, just make this comment, but I think that the question that maybe you still had to go into, that you mentioned last time, mimesis, or mimesis.
Right, mimesis, yeah. Well, that'll certainly play out throughout. Yeah.
That was Canto 17, Bruno, in Purgatory?
Yeah, Canto 17 from of Purgatorio. Wonderful canto. Yeah, I mean, all of them. But yeah.
Because of you, Bruno, I bought a new copy of the Inferno today. I don't have a copy in New York because I've been following your readings, etc. And of course, I like the film by Pasolini, Salo, very much, which is built on the cycles in the Inferno. Eloy, you were ready to talk. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, I have a doubt. Yes, thank you very much. It's very beautiful, very impressive, and very, very nice to hear all your thoughts. But I am struggling with very basic stuff, and the thing that I am struggling with is wrestling with is how can we discern, how can we learn that a speech or that an idea that is expressed by somebody is telling the truth?
Right.
And I am asking you because I found that very relevant in the context in which I live in. We live here in a society that is, so-called mosaic. There are different cultures talking to each other. And so people is very fearful of talking about the truth. And then also we have this influence that it was important, but at the same time it creates some troubles in the university. For example, these ideas that the idea of truth builds regimes of knowledge that subordinate, subjugate other forms of knowledge, and then this idea of truth is a very dangerous for democracy. It is said here in the context in which I live in. Though I read a lot about this now that we are reading this and I'm listening to it, and so I grapple with that. So how can we discover or find out that a speech or a statement is telling the truth? By which method?
Yeah, I mean that's a loaded question. Yeah, I mean I don't know if there's an easy answer to it. I mean, first of all, in the reading we're doing now with the Badiou, he has what he calls truth procedures. We'll get to that later. How one makes a procedure towards the truth. But I'm reminded when you speak, the thing seems to be 2 things at stake here vis-a-vis some of the French post-structuralist advances, to my mind. Foucault is the one who talks about regimes of truth, right, in a way, right, and the politics of truth and truth-telling, right, and the truth-telling would be in the assembly. But Foucault is the one who really speaks about regimes of truth. How does this noble lie become repeated, and then becomes a regime of truth that excludes the voice of the other, which of course is in Gramsci's subaltern the margins, right? Too, the Greeks had a term for the margins, the magri, right? That the philosophy came from the margins, right? Not was part of the center. This was kind of the interesting thing about it. The fools, right, or the gadfly in the moment, right, that would do this. But what you're speaking to at one level is the sophistry, and this goes back to what Bruno and I and we've spoken to as a group many times about the role of the sophist, who does not really believe there is a truth, right? Right? And that, that really it's about the formal argumentation and the better argumentation and the strategies of argumentation and learning how to argue well. So when I brought up this whole thing of the Democrats have already caved, these are the exercises we can do in everyday life where the Democrats have already caved on Amy Coney. She's going to be the next Supreme Court justice, right? They're going to win this one. It's clear. When they cave on this, they're really, in some ways, submitting to a regime of methodology, right, that makes someone able to evade every crucial question, right, about the truth. This is the exercise that went on in the United States this week, in these last 3 days. That you're able to deflect through skilled argumentation or skilled rehearsal to put this truth aside. So the sophistry is working, very, very well here. Now, you can come back with better sophistry, which I don't think the Democrats really did, in this thing. So, this is another battle, and it becomes very complicated. I don't think there's a simple answer, because you're really asking a great question. Richard, you wanted to say something? Yeah, please.
Well, something I've heard many people speak about, but I don't really I can't elaborate on it, but the difference between truth versus true and false. And in a scientific culture, the idea of true versus false, in contrast to the notion of truth.
Right.
And the way that when you get into the idea of this opposition, it's one kind of regime of conceptual way of thinking versus a notion of truth, which is not, I'm just wondering about the sense of what Eloy was talking about in terms of a mosaic culture. And if the notion of truth is in a way, has a subtlety to it that the notion of true versus false doesn't.
Well, let me just say this: the philosopher, in terms of definitional terms and historically, is really trying to gain entry to the city of reason, if you will. Think about this as a philosophical activity is to gain entry into the city of reason, to be part of that tribunal, if you will, of what is reason. And within that reason, yes, there's truths that lead you there. However, right, in some ways, there's never really this. I mean, what Richard and when you use the word mosaic or rainbow or something like that, that opens up the question there to the philosopher is no longer the drive for universals, right? In a way, it becomes relativist, right? In some ways, the truth then becomes relative. So in some ways, Kierkegaard is sort of the master at this, and Bruno can speak to this because he writes about singularity, but Kierkegaard is the first in modern philosophy to go back to the ancients, the concept of irony in Socrates and in traditional philosophy. How is it that, truth is not really objective, in a sense? Because what Plato's trying to do in this diagram I'm doing is make the truth understanding as a path to the truth through this mathematical objectification. So the mathematical truths and scientific truths that Richard speaks to are based on true and false, based on hypotheses that can be tested, experiments, etc., which opens up another kind of thing. But the truth of individuation, as someone like Bruno who's with us has talked about, singularity, right, is singularity. It's subjective, right? to many. So that subjective processes are also going around. And again, Badiou will speak of subjective justice versus objective justice. What does it mean to be just in one context versus another? And then how do we have this drive, this search for universals? And remember the republic or the political community that's being presupposed here, or being supposed to be written about and rehearsed again, is really about the drive for a universal definition of justice, right? Right? It really is. This is the overarching the question. It goes through many transformations, etc. And then we have to ask, do we know the truth without knowing the opposition? What are the methods that take us there? So in some ways, Foucault is really the master sophist by examining regimes of truths. Derrida is the master, in terms of throwing this whole thing into question through deconstruction. How do we get to the point of where we legitimate something as the truth? This is really what deconstruction is ultimately about, is understanding how does truth become legitimated, or what you say, into regimes of truth, like Foucault would talk about. What is this process of legitimization that takes place, in a sense? Yeah, David, please. Yeah, and then Hugo. Yeah.
But it occurs to me that the way that you're using the example of the Supreme Court hearings, like if we looked at like cable news, if we just bracket out everything else that tells us stories about politics,
right?
Then like the storytellers of that city, right? If cable news is the storytellers and the only storytellers about politics in the city.
Right.
The discourse that you get is a validation of like a PR discourse on both sides of what is supposed to be a debate. So that like the liar and the lied to are both in this regime of truth, where they both accept that everybody knows that this is all bullshit. But because they said the thing that's like expected in the pattern, they are then sort of like validated for saying the thing that's expected in the pattern, even though the thing that's expected in the PR pattern has nothing to do with like the events in the world that it's supposed to signify. It's just that like the interviewer and the interviewee all get that we're playing this language game here, and we play the same language game. And so like, just as a thought, like a thought experiment, bracketing everything else out, if all you get is this standard cable news sort of narrative, then that's the only story that makes sense to you, right? Like you would then reject a deliberative democratic discourse because it would sound weird. It would sound like you're not in the proper pattern. You're not telling the proper story. So we're in a moment where like even at a moment of like great scrutiny, and even especially at a moment where someone's intellectual abilities are being scrutinized, what you get is exactly an avoidance of the scrutiny of their intellectual ability that is accepted by the people who are supposed to be questioning their intellectual ability, because this logic
good point.
Goes all the way
Very
out.
good point. Yeah, the truth is already known. I know, Hugo, I'm going to go to you. Yeah, please. Yeah.
What David just said, actually, sort of, I could piggyback off of in terms of what I was.
Good. Okay.
What I think, one way I think about what David described is exactly what Socrates rails against, which is why, in a way, Plato tries to, in a way, reinvent dialogue or discourse or speech through this telling of the Socratic story, in a sense, which is tied to the whole crux issue of mimesis, right? Which is imitation or representation. So this section that we're in about mimesis, I think, is really critical in that Badiou seems to be, he's like reversing the position of French philosophy as it's come to be, in a sense. And it's like he's not repudiating, say, a Derrida, but in a way he is trying to reframe it, because there's all this stuff in here as we're reading, that true political speech is presentation, not representation.
Right.
So, and this is one of the things that Derrida rejects, as the notion of presence, that you can ever have access to presence, to a kind of authentic real. It's always mediated through representation or imitation or.
Right.
But Badiou's kind of restaking this ground, attempting to reformulate this idea. And it's an interesting notion, but it's both a return to the kind of classic narrative of Western philosophy that kind of runs aground.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to be redeploying it for a revolutionary purpose, which is
Right.
that's
I
like,
think you're really on to something here, at least in my mind. I think Badiou is very radically conservative, and that he returns to the classics, right, in a way, and he returns to the dialogical form in this sense, in a way of disrupting and, setting up something in terms of a longer horizon of Western philosophy, that it's not just deconstructing its metaphysics. I think he brings, you're right, brings presence back into it, or the notion of presentation as well. At the same time, he wants to use this for revolutionary purposes. So in a way, Plato becomes, for him, a revolutionary in a new kind of democratic materialism. He's trying to use this dialectical form as a new materialism, this dialectical form, and not have it dismissed as part of just, representative of the idealization of the Egyptian caste system, in terms of the division of labor, or, Plato is the twilight of the idols, or how the true world became a fable. Nietzsche, right, in a sense. So Badiou has this conservative, I would call it a radical, in the sense of rerouting or replanting, if you will, this very conservative that you point out, going back to the classics, to the history of Western philosophy, and working with these texts, right, in a way. You would never see Derrida attempt to rewrite or reconfigure a classical work like this, nor Foucault. Right, in a way. They may take a little part of it and work it out, but you would not see that. So I think you're right, in a sense. There's a kind of a defense, if you will, a new wall put up against some of the post-structuralist thought, in many ways. And that's interesting to me, because I think he has this very conservative tendency, to go back to this in terms of the classics. Again, yeah, very, very, very important to remember this. And he has, there are poets that he reads, like Pessoa from Portugal, the Portuguese poet, is, someone who was not on the left. Mayakovsky certainly was on the left, certainly Neruda, certainly these great, but when he goes in his pantheon of poets, he has poets that were actually fascists, right, in this too. So he has this kind of interesting mix, if you will, right, in terms of the truth, right, and what he's looking for. So I don't think Badiou is looking at procedures. I think David brought up something very important: the language games and political rhetoric. That, again, going back to where Eloy started, this is very much in one of the great. Again, I'm sorry to do this, but I think it's worth reading. I mean, I don't know, worth reading The Différent of Jean-Francois Lyotard. And if you're reading Badiou in French, you certainly can handle The Différent, because it's really about saving the different, the name, saving the voice, if you will, of the other, of the margin. Right? This is really what it's about. Contextually, it was about that, someone made the statement, the camps did not exist. So Lyotard wrote a whole book just based on that proposition, what that would mean, and develops this category called the différent, the end of difference, right? Where it is different, where is its limit, etc. So in some ways, yes, I don't know if Badiou is going to give us a precise definition of the truth, nor is Plato going to give us a precise definition of universal justice, except that it is harmony, right? In a way. For example, I watched for a class, it was not my idea, but I enjoyed watching it, Theater of War, which is a group, they did something called Antigone and Ferguson. Right, where the choir is the chorus, gospel singers. It's interesting, and it's for people reading it. It's cast around the killing of who was it? Michael Brown, I think, in Ferguson, right? And And I mean, it was interesting. I kind of returned to the classics here and a rewriting of it and a rethinking of it for contemporary times, right? So I call it the Black Antiquity, right? And it's like Black Athena, too, in a sense. But some of the universal themes, to go back, are continued, right? The conflict between the law of the family, the law of the state. What is state terror? A lot of stuff that's still in Plato and certainly in the Greek tragedies. So again, what of this can we extract instead of getting ultimately the truth? I mean, as Richard points out, there are mathematical truths, and the work on that is in the philosophy of Gottlieb Frege, on mathematical logic, mathematical language, ordinary and extraordinary languages, natural languages. So we have these traditions that are really critiquing what is the truth or what are truth tables in philosophy, etc. But this is used for scientific and mathematical purposes. Then, people such as Bruno and others that are really talking about the singularity and individuation, truth means something very different, right? In a way. But to Plato, the drive, once again, is this search. And as I said earlier, the philosopher is always searching for the universal language, the universal grammar, if you will. And this is a very long story. Again, Wittgenstein, who we've never done anything in this, these Left Forum Institute for Radical Imagination classes, wrote a philosophical grammar. Right? You have books written on the grammar of objects by Vincent Descamps, right? Etc. How do you write this grammar? And grammar is our Greek friends know comes from grammae, to write, right? And Nietzsche says we haven't killed God because we haven't killed grammar yet. This is interesting, right? In a sense, God is not so much the big other in the Lacanian sense as Badiou is saying, but maybe the grammar of the language, that the unconscious is structured like a language, or language is the house of being. And how do we set up that military opposition? How do we have a grammar of politics, to go back to your question, based on truth and truth procedures? So again, I don't think I'm really answering your question. I know I'm roundabout sophistry here, but just to set up some thoughts, and I'm interested in anybody else if they want to say something. Yeah, I knew you would, Bruno. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no. I mean, there would be so much to say, of course, but the question of truth, of course, so difficult, as you said, fascinating. But the one thing that I want to say, also because you often pointed out the question of individuation, just like individuation is ultimately impossible, right? Full individuation, because it's always an open process, right? So the same with the truth, and as you say, even for Plato, it's the search for the truth, the universals, and maybe something which is very broad, but it might be good to point that out at this point, right? The question between the working together, but also the difference between metaphysics / ontology on the one hand, right? Therefore, the study of the essence of reality, of a being, of that which is, and then on the other, epistemology, which is what stands on itself. That's the meaning of epistemology, therefore the theory of knowledge, we say, but it's that which is standing on itself. But there is always a divide, and any type of knowledge must, and I like what Hugo said very much, but ultimately any kind of knowledge to think about, to speak about, it is in this about, right, many people have said, I believe, that you already have that distance between what is and what is represented as being, right? So any kind of epistemology, unless it is the epistemology of the dog, that's why I like the dog example, which is very intuitive and very individuating, it always happens at a distance from the thing which is known. And that's a problem that probably will never be solved. But as Kant said in relation to metaphysics, that maybe we will keep asking the question, right? Just on virtue of its being so fascinating and so important. And so that's why the sophists, in a sense, and they're problematic, but there are things that I like about this office, as you mentioned before. Also, we spoke often about this. They simply say, you know what, just erase the question. There is no truth. Just make it up.
Forget it. Yeah.
Which is right. Which is what we actually very often do in the language of the law, politics, opinion, and so on and so forth. That's what we do. So they say, in a sense, they are, let's say, in quote, honest, right? So they say, stop all this searching for something that you will never be able to find, just make it up.
Right. And this is Nietzsche's critique, too. Nietzsche, in a way, is the ultimate sophist because he's so clever, beyond good and evil. Why do we keep saying that's evil? Why do we keep saying that's good, etc.? Can't we go through beyond this, right? Don't we understand this as rhetoric and temporality, right? Don't we begin to see this for what it is, right? In a sense. And, going back to Marx and this whole thing of presentation, Marx distinguishes about his method, right? My method of research is different from my method of presentation. Marx is trying to make present research. This is the Darstellung of Marx. It's very interesting. He is trying to go beyond representation or Vorstellung, right, in the German language. And Stellung is the root, if you will, of constellations of meaning, right, in a sense. So this is, again, something that's very interesting, that the method of research is different from the method of presentation. And Marx uses the word presentation. He does not use representation. He does not use Vorstellung. He is presenting, the research. So, yeah. In order to get to maybe the truth, if you will, or the truth of capital, so to speak, right? Okay, yeah, Richard, yes, please.
Oh, well, yeah. Also, I was interested in, because of you, I went back, was reading Dialectics of Enlightenment, and the kind of the focus they put on calculating, the idea of calculating, or almost a society of calculation, as being kind of a dark path, you could say, that the Enlightenment takes. And in the translation, in Bloom's translation, I was fascinated. So the word for like logistikon, which means skilled in logos, argument,
right.
It's translated in Bloom as skilled in calculation, skilled in calculating. He's constantly translating logos and as calculation, which is an interesting, it's one of those cases that really maybe translation doesn't give us a good,
right.
At a key moment, into English doesn't give us a good translation, but and it radically takes it one way. You could say it's very interesting, just because of the, you could almost say these two paths are contained within the concept of logos. Logos as argument, and logos on the other hand as 4 + 4 = calculation, where you get, the right answer or the wrong answer. On the other sense of logos, which is this back and forth, this dialectic, and how both these things are at play in the Greek, and the translated. Right. It's just interesting, I thought.
Again, going back to the diagram that I just kind of did a few years ago, etc. Or the idea is that once you cross on the mathematical line, you do the turning, right? You're turned around, so to speak. It's no longer that you're just seeing the light of the day and, your reflective capacity is changing. You're blinded by the light, to use the metaphor of the prisoner who goes back down into the cave. Once you hit that point of understanding and the mathematical objects, you're already in what you described that Alain Bloom translates as logos, as, number, as calculation.
Right.
At the same time, you're leading up to the next thing in terms of the progression towards the good, right, which is obviously the idea of ideas in Plato, the idea of the good. That at that level, then you go to the next level, which is reason, logos as reason, right, as ratio too, because reason has ratio in it as well. So this maybe the ratio, the ratio, is also very crucial here in this kind of understanding, and dialectic too that comes out of that, bringing us back in some ways. I mean, I'm sorry we're not going to go all the way deeply of this as deeply as we should into music, right? And music and its use, right? Because he speaks about the one side, the music, right, as the foundation of one part of the discipline of the mind, and then in that discipline of the mind, it includes poetry, narrative, and all what we consider the arts, right? But the arts are also connected to the mathematics, as is mathematics can be also, to physical training, right? Repetition, counting, etc. The level of mathematics that's involved in everyday life is overwhelming when you really think about this. How much we do, the counting of steps when we walk, right? How many times do we do this, etc., etc. So yes, I think the Adorno and Horkheimer is that they're criticizing how everything becomes reduced to the ratio, to the calculated rationality, and that both the Desadian universe, both we see. I think there are many great readers of Desade, but I think this essay, Lacan's Kant avec Sade, Pasolini's film, of course, Salo, right? But and then the collection Shall We Burn Sade all have very different, very interesting insights. But Sade is the ratio of our time, right? The Friends for the Society of Crime, right? That is developing at this time in capitalism. It's setting up, right? The 19th century industrial capital moment, right? In many ways, yeah. And also the use of child labor, all these things start to happen, right? And it's Desade who backs off from equality, right? It's a different ratio at work, right? This is what Desade is against the French Revolution. Didn't happen. And the Straussians are too, by the way. They don't really go that way. For Adorno and Horkheimer, the progress of the Enlightenment, and we think this way in the United States a lot, too much optimism, right? In a way. It's the triumph of progress or optimism. We're always thinking, Henry Wallace was great in 1948, etc. I think Adorno and Horkheimer in The Dialectic of Enlightenment show us that there's no such thing as progress, right? In some ways, that the truth of progress is not progress. And some people in this session, had we read this with Aronowitz on progress, the idea of progress, and how Adorno takes it down. Yeah, Hugo, you wanted to? Yeah.
No. I was just.
Oh, okay.
Just gesturing to myself.
Okay. Yeah. Eloy, yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for all your talks. Very nice.
Too many of them. Yeah.
When you mentioned Adorno, it came to my mind as a lightning, as a flash. This famous phrase from his negative dialectics that says that allow suffering to speak is the condition of all truth. And by him meant, if I understood well, that we approach the truth when we can distinguish those things that makes the blush to reveal through suffering. That is everything that suppress or it intends to suppress life and creates a suffering, and then it's a manifestation of that and the lie. What is bad. And so the truth seems to me, actually what you said and also what I learned from Adorno, that is discovering of the things that make life better. I am that. I'm sorry. I'm just it's just chaos.
Okay. No, it's all right. Yeah. I mean, going back to Mimesis, Adorno's famous sentence on Mimesis: "No poetry after Auschwitz."
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this was something that really, I mean, both also got him in trouble, but at the same time, it was a statement of that this cannot be presented. There's no possibility of real speech after this horror. Right? Yeah, yeah, Jeremy, I mean, Richard, yeah, and then
Well,
Chair. Yeah.
Eloy's thing, that quote reminded me of another really interesting problematic thing to translate from ancient Greek is this kind of core concept in ancient Greek, which is pathemathos, which usually, which means we get patient from it or pathetic. It usually is suffering. And mathos, of course, is like math or learning. And it's usually translated into English as through experience comes learning. But experience here really is suffering. It's a very interesting, that quote that Eloy brought up made me think of this other kind of, forgotten reading of this concept that somehow, and this is on some level very Lacanian, but I'm not, is the notion that that there's a relation of suffering to mathos, to, again, this level of mathematics or level of structure. But
No, it's interesting too. And, pathos at a distance is also Nietzsche too. The suffering from a distance, right, is another aspect of this that allows us beyond Grundrisse. Jeremy, you wanted to say something?
No, it's just that in light of that discussion of Adorno and Auschwitz, there's this Neruda poem called "I'm Explaining a Few Things," where there's this line where he says, "The blood of the children flew down the street like the blood of the children." He's refusing explicitly, like simile or metaphor, to make that very comparable political point. I mean, it's not that it can't be represented, but at least in this line, it has to be represented by itself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I just want to say something going back to this whole thing about presentation and the truth. William Faulkner, who was once asked, the writer, asked about his ambition, right? And in literature, etc. He said, what his ambition is to make the sentence perfectly present, but never succeeded with this because the past is always past. We cannot really come to this full presence, and really in a way, Faulkner anticipates the Derridian, attack upon presence, etc. So sometimes, as Freud reminds us, and Lacan in a different way, we lay down our arms before the poets and the artists, right, in a sense, as theorists or as philosophers, and this is a lesson sometimes we need to learn from. We can certainly think about it later and have that relationship, but here we have someone like William Faulkner who says, I want to put everything in the present tense through language, right? To defeat the sophistry of delay or the Nachtragkeit of the deferred action, etc., which is all part of writing. So I think this is interesting. I mean, this is a very good discussion. The difference between presentation, representation, can we get to real presence? Is Badiou's project in some ways an attempt to do this by going back to the ancients, or what is ultimately the project against his contemporaries? I think this is a very relevant question. Where is he situated vis-a-vis, if you want to think of this, the big three after Sartre and Lacan's death, Foucault, Derrida, and Deleuze, right? Badiou considers himself the last. I said this at the beginning. The last line of the great French philosophers, beginning with Henri Bergson. He is the last of the lines. And I know someone earlier, Nathan's reading the difference in repetition. I mean, that's a great transitional work. It's a transitional ontology, and the way I look at things, I mean, is ontology. So this is interesting. So again, I think Bruno set up a nice opposition between the metaphysics and the ontology and epistemology. The question really is, there are epistemic truths, right? If you will, right? They can be epistemic truths, in science, in mathematics, right, etc., that are subjected to truth procedures and truth laws of truth tables and these kind of things, and mathematical logic, a different kind of logic. On the other hand, the truths of ontology are much harder to get to, or the truth of ontology, right? What is being still perplexes us. We're still confused by the situation. I don't know. Does that sum it up well enough, Bruno? Or
I mean, I absolutely,
Go
but
ahead.
I also wanted to add, I mean, because it is
Yeah.
really fascinating, the whole thing, but the question of representation versus presentation, especially,
Right.
and then there was another point I wanted to make, but that's representation is always, of course, I mean, I'm saying something obvious, but it is always the place of an absence, right? I mean, that which is presented again, represented, is made present again, precisely because it is not there. It is absent.
Right.
This is what always happens as soon as we move into the realm of the abstract, which begins with language, with thinking, and so on, right? I mean, there is something absent, and maybe we always live in and within a place of absence, right? So we are, in a sense, forced to represent something, because, and actually, if I may, the next point that I want to make can be linked to this, the question of pathos that Richard spoke about, and Eloy mentioned suffering, the same. But this pathos is also, I believe, right, not only, yes, suffering, of course, but it is also the affection. So, I mean, there is here, if you will, a link to
The affect is there. Yeah.
the affect, right? I mean, we are affected.
Yeah.
And insofar as we are affected, the emotions in general, therefore, there is a moment of passivity, right? I mean, passivity comes passive passion. All these words, they come from pathos, precisely, right? So, and this is unavoidable, right? So it is then, to use the Lucian and Guattarian language, the line of flight might be that of, moving away from this initial, perhaps, pathos into some kind of understanding. That is Spinoza again, with the use of reason and so on and so forth, right? But I mean, what I was thinking is that maybe we are always in between this presentation and representation kind of a strange place, right? Maybe. And since you mentioned Faulkner before, I mean, I made an association. I was like, As I Lay Dying, at one point, Faulkner has the drawing of the coffin, right? I mean, of the mother who dies. I mean, there is this, again, another representation, but there is probably supposed to be more concrete than perhaps already the abstraction of words. Sorry, and maybe I said too many things.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I wanted to reflect about Hannah Arendt, and the idea that philosophers can't save us when things go bad politically. It just can't, because every universal attempt is tyrannical at its heart, and it can be easily co-opted by a different tyrant. So fascism will only fall from journalists. Only reporting of facts can actually interrupt and is truly threatening to the Nazis.
Along those lines, it's still interesting, I mean, or in that context, it's still interesting to me that Badiou is making this move, or makes this move back to Plato. And I mean, one way I'm sort of just thinking about is that I guess he's doing a kind of Marxist rereading. It's like he is being Marx reading Plato, and yet, which is interesting in and of itself, but can Plato really be abstracted or I don't know, abstracted or liberated from the Platonic positions, that define the terms. I don't. There's something about this move that Badiou is making which puzzles me, and I don't know.
Can you be precise about the move you're thinking about? Other than the recasting of Plato. I mean, this is the result, by the way, of a seminar. I know the result of a seminar that he gave from 2007 to 2011 on Plato, right? The return to Plato and what he considers concepts of democratic materialism. And then he went back and retranslated from the ancient Greek, his version of it, in the 16 chapters, with a lot of modern references, I'm sure that you've seen, etc. But what do you see? I mean, tell me what.
Just this move to reappropriate or repurpose Plato. I just think it's an interesting move. I mean, what led him to do that, and can he ultimately be successful in repositioning Plato within the sort of philosophical trajectory of Western culture? I don't, Western politics. I don't know if it can be done, because ultimately this set of thought structures do lead to a kind of, I'm sort of just going out there on a limb, do lead to a kind of authoritarian totalitarianism. I mean, it doesn't, can it be dislodged from that and reversed in this way? I just don't know if that's feasible. It's intriguing to me that he's doing it or trying to do it, but I don't, apropos of Adorno and Horkheimer, I mean, they would stay as far away from Plato as they possibly could. It doesn't, but yet Badiou is going to Plato as a source. Maybe it's in this historical moment or in this conjuncture or something that we have no alternative but to resuscitate this tradition that has led to our demise. It's just intriguing to me that he's doing this.
Right. I mean, in some ways, you're echoing Popper's, thought here about that the Platonic universe leads to a kind of totalitarian, authoritarian statism, and he said the same of Marx too. So the two antagonists to Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, right, are both Plato and Marx. So that is the MI6, if you want to put this in, intelligence agency vernaculars, is what happened after World War II. These two representatives of thinking, right, at least to Karl Popper's mind, were about, and Lydia actually pointed out what Hannah Arendt had to say, that the philosophers should stay out of politics. I think she was kind of saying that too, from her own responsibility with Heidegger too. That Heidegger, if you read Heidegger, the Heidegger of 1931, 32, 33, 34 is very different from the Heidegger of 39 through 45, and radically different than the Heidegger of 47 until his death. So, in some ways. So, Heidegger is really like, the Plato, of his time, right? And he sees in National Socialism a moment of, the philosopher's thought being actualized, and Nietzsche too. In a way, the will to power is a combination of a new Machiavellianism, to my mind. This is, in fact, in Nietzsche's notes. So I think, what Lydia brings up is very important in a sense. Should the philosopher, be involved in the political thinking, or do we turn to the philosophers at this point? And this goes back, again, to Plato, the seventh letter, if you've read the seventh letter, because he goes to visit his student in Syracuse who says, he's completely burned out by politics at this point. If you read the seventh letter of Plato, going to see Dion, in Syracuse. So this is an interesting question, the relationship of, again, because Badiou, we read him we read Badiou because we like his quote. He doesn't like the idea of political philosophy, but the relationship between politics and philosophy. So for him, politics, the book Ethics, metapolitics are all are moving this way, but they're I think dependent upon, going back to where you started with this, I think 45 minutes ago, of his conservatism or his return to the ancients, is back to the ontology and the epistemologies of the ancients in a way, right? This is a diversion, if you will, a move against the Kantian cosmopolitanism, against the Enlightenment, against the kind of liberalism that we've been accustomed to. So I think he's fighting that on another level. So I think it's very complex, the question you bring up, and what Lydia brings up too, because I'm not so sure that the philosophers can offer something. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a brief follow to what you just said. One way that I'm sort of reading it is that it's like he's talking to the generation of '68. He sort of turned these interlocutors into the
absolutely
generation of '68.
I'm in agreement. Yes.
The world they've created, who now run the world.
Yes. I mean, some of them run the world. Yeah.
Some of them run the world. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not so sure that ex-68ers are. I'm just looking for a quote that I got here. I'm just trying to find the book if I have it. I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, I have it for you. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is this long conversation with his generation of '68 that he sees non-fidelitists that sold out, right? I mean, you can probably substitute a whole lot of French intellectuals here, the new philosophers, Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy, Christian Jambet, another one who went back to Plato, who he's confronting, right? The people around Althusser, there's an ongoing, conversation with Etienne Balibar. So yes, I agree with you, and who is Amantha? Is the leading French feminists of the day. That's another thing too. We could certainly transpose into this, but still, I think there's thought going on. Yeah. And yes, he's a continuation of May of '68. I wanted to read something. Let me see if I have it here. The early during the 1968-70 school year, the FBI recorded 1,785 student demonstrations, with 313 buildings occupied. This is in the United States. In 1970, 1 million college students told public opinion takers they considered themselves revolutionaries, and 10 million believed they would see a revolution in the United States in their lifetime. So think about that in relation to today. 1,785 student demonstrations, 313 buildings occupied. And then we get excited about Zuccotti Park. Yeah, I mean, think about this really in a larger historical framework, right? Yeah. And Jeremy knows this with the Black radical tradition, the Black liberation movements, the Black freedom movements too. How these were, very different than what Black Lives Matter represents today. I'm not nostalgic. I'm just saying, think about this because you bring up '68, right? In a sense, right? It's a very different time. For Badiou, the event is '68, May of '68. It's one of the four events for him. Again, the French Revolution, 1789, against the Sade, against Horkheimer and Adorno's reading of the Enlightenment, right? For him, progress, right? A movement forward as an event. The next one, of course, is the 1871 Paris Commune, then the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and then May of '68. These are events of which he thinks, you have to remain fidelitous to their principles, like Socrates remains fidelitous to the principles of justice and excellence, right? That he articulates throughout the Platonic thing. And I don't know if you probably know the painting, the Jacques-Louis David painting, The Death of Socrates, which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is done by David as inspiration for the Republic of Virtue, right? The French revolutionists, the Jacobins, are talking about the Republic of Excellence, of virtue, right? This is what they're trying to set up, after the revolution. So Socrates becomes a figure which is used symbolically. And Jacques-Louis David is one of the most revolutionary persons there, but he's drawing upon the neoclassical tradition in painting, as we know. So maybe what you say, maybe Badiou, in a way, is a kind of ironic figure. I'm just following the line of thought, is an ironic figure in terms of that he becomes a kind of neoclassical thinker in the midst of this, right? To try to bring up these models again, right? For our times. Because if you read this here, he has many, many references to contemporary society, many, many references, many things in the art world too. I think in a way you see the wealth and depth of his work, whether or not we're going to agree with all of the premises and everything that's working out, or if we're going to find the answer or the truth here, it's another story, of course. But as an exercise and something that maybe we could look at, we can ask the question again as leftists, as quote, whatever we identify ourselves as today. What does it mean to have the good life? What does this really mean? What is justice and happiness in our world now? What can we, really hope for? And to go back to the Adorno thing and this whole thing, the question of mimesis, Benjamin has a great thing about hope. We must have hope for those without hope, right? Is that the hope, the only hope we have left, given where we are in the world? We're basically looking at 5 major authoritarian regimes, right, running the world right now. 5 major ones, and I'm not putting China or any of the other, countries or Russia in that mix. We have Bolsonaro, Brazil, Trump, America, Netanyahu, Israel, right? Modi in India, right? Erdogan in Turkey. I can go down the list even more, but 5 major ones, right now, yeah, and in a way. And also how those regimes have responded to the COVID crisis. It would be an interesting study for someone, then they can go on Amy Goodman, to Democracy Now! And talk about it, but to study this through the authoritarian regimes, why India's gotten hit so much, why has Brazil gotten hit, why has the United States by the COVID, right? Why isn't it being controlled? How does authoritarianism and authoritarian regimes happen this way? I don't, to think about this from a position of Badiou vis-a-vis 68, this is complete insanity, what's going on in the United States right now. When you see a Supreme Court thing being railroaded this, you have a president talking about stuffing boxes in California, where you have a national election where they're putting up, post office boxes. First they try to steal the post office, right? I'm reminded of Bob Dylan, the mailbox is lost, the post office has been stolen and the mailbox is lost. They're trying to rig an election publicly. Vote twice publicly, these kind of things that we're going through. And I'm just, those are little just tidbits. I'm talking structurally, it's much worse, as we know, right? So anyway, I think, again, you're absolutely right, positioning him vis-a-vis the interlocutions of his friends and the people he grew up with in 68. Andrei Glucksmann became a thinker of the state. He became a, defense expert. Right, he became, I think he, was in the French ministry, right, a nuclear strategist, right. This is a Maoist with Badiou, right, in the 1960s. Bernard-Henri Lévy, we all know about BHL, Mr. Famous, right? And then a lot of his other people, and his inability to conform to the Mitterrand socialist progress, so to speak, right? That everybody thought was progress in 1980. Yeah, Jeremy. Yeah.
If you were going to make it, not personal, because I know we're very fond of this person, but how would you understand the Balabar-Badiou tension, specifically around questions of revolution and reform? But it seemed to, at least in the commentary, it hovered around Plato's Republic, where, in a certain kind of circle, it'd be like, ha ha ha, that's not what one should do as a revolutionary, rewrite Plato's Republic. How do you understand that? Because, and I don't mean it in a personal way, I mean in terms of the history of ideas, because Balibar is not Henri Levy, right? And there seems to me this like tension, I don't know, frenemy thing going on.
Well, there's a tension with Deleuze too on the ontological level, which Bruno brought up, the clamor of being. There is this thing about how one writes and rewrites ontology too, right? So this is part of these things. I mean, the French are known for polemics, right? We know this. In America, we agree to disagree, right? Right? This is how we operate, in many ways, and kind of this pragmatic approach. In the French culture, polemics. And I think that, I've had this discussion with some people about, we don't have polemics in this country because we don't have the depth. Polemics require depth. This is the interesting thing. We have the surface. What Lydia said earlier is very true. We need journalistic, investigative reporting in the political sphere to make us aware, because we don't have that depth, required for the polemics really to develop and unfold. So yeah, I mean, the tension between Balibar and Badiou is that, I mean, Balibar was a member of the Communist Party. I mean, you have to remember too that a lot of these people, such as Althusser and Balibar, stayed in the party despite everything, right? Despite everything. It was a Stalinist party that never really got over its Stalinist Hegelianism, and I have, again, a different kind of relationship to Stalinism and what it means historically, et cetera, and what the period was about. But at the same time, this was something that, Balibar and Badiou, Balibar and Althusser stayed in the party throughout. Balibar got kicked out of the party for writing an article called Open Your Windows, Comrade, 1978, right? And in some ways, a lot of these intellectuals became sort of favorable, more Derrida, Roland Barthes, and others, towards the Mitterrand government. Balibar continued to write, but, sort of went the way of that communism itself is not a name we should use anymore. It's too filled with, too much bad weight, right? Too much ideological weight. So in a way, this may be a start of the debate. And Badiou never really gave up on his Maoism or on his communism. He's really stayed in touch with this. So you can really see this in some ways as a Platonic Maoism as well, which would kind of be an interesting essay or something, that you could extend, right? So Balibar accuses, and this is an interesting, dialogue that goes on between them, of theology. Right? There's this accusation that Badiou is engaged in a kind of a new onto-theology, right? Yeah. In many ways. So, yeah. So I think, again, it's one of these, friendly but not so friendly. They grew up together. They came up May of '68. Balibar was, I think, about 3 years younger than Badiou. When Balibar was in the Reading Capital group, he wrote the basic problems of historical materialism at 24 years old. Right? Right? This was quite an accomplishment, Yeah. In that period. Yeah. So, very interesting in that way. So anyway, I think there are many, many levels to this, but yeah, the Levy and the Glucksmann, the new philosophers are one thing, and Nathan sent me a piece that I was sort of been aware of, the Rockhill piece on Michel Foucault's reactionary politics to some on the Marxist moment through the biopolitical and his disavowal of Marx during this period. This is another story too that goes on in France, that Foucault went the way of a kind of almost neoliberalism. There's also that thinking that goes on. I'm not so sure that's the best way to approach Michel Foucault. Even with the lectures in the 70s. Yeah. But anyway, this is another story. So this opens up a lot, in a way, because the Nouveau Philosophes, their main thing, and this is again Badiou at work, where he is going to criticize them for using the gulags, right? Using Solzhenitsyn, right? To talk about power, which really, in fact, strengthened neoliberalism and the neo-capitalist class, right? And what horror of horrors that this happened, right? as if, And the previous generation, with Sartre and Camus, went through similar things in terms of not only the gulags, but also, the moment of the East-West split, in a sense. And it seems like Badiou wanted to stay faithful to 1917. And Balibar, in some ways, wanted to move, outside of it, right? In some ways, and not use the language anymore. So what Eloy was talking about, the truth of communism. What does that mean, right? And, we have this movement where Badiou writes the communist hypothesis. Zizek, I forgot, wrote the idea of communism, was it? Bruno Bastos wrote a book, right? Etc. So you had 3 or 4 people who began to reorient this right after the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. And returning to what Hugo mentioned, why choose Plato? Well, this was chosen after the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009. Stiegler is writing the new critique of political economy and states of shock, watching films such as Inside Job, and Badiou retreats, if you will, into the world of classical philosophy, trying to reorient this through a democratic materialism or a new kind of Maoism in the future. So I think, in a way, this is all about speculation about new political communities. How do we go about it? What are the elements? Because we have to think on the left, really, what is justice? What is the good life? What are our projections about this? What does it really mean besides reparations or redistributive, material things? How do we really articulate this and do so in dialogue? And I think these thinkers help us along the way. I don't think they're total answers. At least they give us some thinking. Bruno, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, maybe not for today because it's already late. But another time when we go back to this interesting question about...
We're always late. It's okay.
I know.
Yeah.
The question about Balibar and also the terms, which is not only a terminological question, maybe we can also take up the question of, very interesting book, right? Violence and Civility, by the use of the word civility.
And Balibar, yeah. That's a good point.
He says civility is anti-violence, not counter-violence. And we can speak about that at one point.
Badiou is not afraid of violence, in fact. Badiou has no fear of violence and is not privileging the bourgeois notion of civility or the Hegelian notion of civility against violence. This is not about the philosophy of right in Badiou. I can tell you that. I know that. Yeah. Too much connection to the Cultural Revolution to be thinking in those kind of terms.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, if you read the communist hypothesis carefully, you begin to see some of this mathematics at work too. He has a kind of interesting study of this, through the mathematics of the. It's interesting. He goes through this, and truth procedures he uses in the communist hypothesis. He wants to save the world.
But that's an interesting question, whether that Jeremy brought up, but whether this moving forward is the right thing to do or not, or being faithful, like you say, almost to a Platonic idea of Maoism. I don't know if that's better than looking for alternatives. It's an interesting question in itself, right? We are certainly. Even thinking about the events that Badiou said before, but how about then the collapse of the Soviet Union and the whole Eastern Bloc around? That's also an event that changes things, maybe and certainly in.
Maybe in more ways than May of '68. In some ways, you could argue that.
Of course.
You could argue that we're in the Fifth World War now.
Right.
The Third World War broke out after World War II with all the national liberation struggles. And the Fourth World War broke out with the OPEC, the shift of wealth from one part of the world to another.
I would say that also in the sense that certainly there was a problem with, say, using the word communism. That's not my problem, right?
I hope it's not your problem.
2005, I say, But the question is, if anything, we should and maybe this is what Badiou is doing, also recast, retranslate, perhaps revisit, or we had to reappropriate the word and explain what the meaning really of the, rather than get rid of it, right, of the word altogether, say what. But certainly there was a moment of crisis. I remember even in Italy, when the question of the Communist Party was disbanded.
Well, remember, you have the revolutionary, what do they call it? The democratic, what was it called? The alternative that Gaddafi and others
back then
were with.
was now it's the Democratic Party, whatever. But
right.
And that was the time that the manifesto, for example, took a very good position. The newspaper, the Communist Daily. It's still now called the Communist Daily. So took a very interesting, very good position. But the question is, the crisis was, in a sense, let's use the word objective, right? I mean, there was a moment of, and this is what we had to do also, I believe, in education, no? I mean, understand, make clear that people understand what the word communism really is, which is, this association with Sovietism and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, it's the wrong way. So I don't know. Maybe Badiou is trying something like that, because you said at one point, that he's doing, in going back to the Republic, he's also extracting this kind of new meaningful.
I mean, look, don't you have to think of communism in categories of justice? Isn't it ultimately a theory of justice on earth? I mean, right, in some ways, I mean, it goes well beyond the liberal notion of justice, right, in many ways. And as we know, we have all these theoretical moments from John Rawls, to others that, are speaking about theories of justice. So, and Eloy brings up tonight love and justice, right? There's
and poetry.
And poetry, of course, right.
But
right,
so it is really to recast it in terms of the common and the relationship between the common and the singular, like many people are doing, of course.
Fair enough,
Virno, Negri, and so on,
Fair enough, yeah. And I wanted to mention, apropos Balibar, when you bring up violence and civility, Balibar wrote a piece on Lenin and Gandhi, too. About 60 pages on this very issue of violence, nonviolence, and civility, right? So the two figures, the nonviolent, right, and the Bolshevik rupture, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, if you read history, and I mean, this is certainly not the only way to read it, but if you read our history, in a sense, on the left, as everything is a reaction to what happened in 1917. Foreign policy, all the efforts, all the attempts in terms of, the corporate welfare state, management, labor problems, right, et cetera, educational struggles, et cetera, are really based off that event. That's one thing that has to not happen again. This repetition should not happen again, right, in many ways. This is the reactionary force that has taken over at very many crucial times, right? And you can read, of course, the New Deal. It's the new boss, but it's same as the old boss, but with a little more for the people, right? And in some ways, the New Deal, which, everybody gets excited about Bernie Sanders. He's basically was a New Deal Democrat on a good day. It had nothing to do with socialism, right? In a sense, or democratic socialism ultimately, right? In a way, it was a New Deal politics in many ways. So to think of it that way, and then to think, as you like to do, Bruno, and I think it's an important part, to think about violence and civility within that framework, within that reactionary thing. What will happen? And I'm of the persuasion that I don't think that the Voting Rights Bill or the Civil Rights Bill and many of the outgrowths of progressive things for American blacks would have happened without the cities getting close to being torched, right? Armed, militia groups, etc. That this would not have happened just by peaceful marching or, good, reasonable discourse in the schools. I may be wrong, but I don't really think it would have happened without that threat, right? That was going on. Yeah. in many ways. And, and one wing of Black Lives Matter now has this black militia, black military. I don't know if you've seen the YouTube videos, but again, will this push, right, in a certain way, or is this going to feed into the counter-revolutionary or reactionary forces again? So this is a very open question when you bring up violence and civility, etc. Right? Yeah. So yeah. And one that's
Violence.
please.
I don't think it's in the part we read this time, but it was interesting in the Republic. I don't know. I can't remember if it's book 3 or 4 where he talks about the old people. About the old fat kind of rulers versus the young, tough, lean and mean dogs.
Right.
And can one lean and mean dog take on a couple? It's pretty it's pretty tough. It's definitely these guys, these dogs are dogs. I mean, these dogs are also guard dogs. I mean, they're not. There's no.
Right.
These aren't nice, fluffy, nice little dust mops. These are tough dogs.
Right.
There's a presence of the threat of the threat of violence is constant in Greece, but the democracy. I mean, this is one thing that in Thucydides in Mytilene, when the revolt and the I forget his name, who says he curses in a way and says, you members of a democracy, you think you can just talk your way out of everything.
Right.
And then you get involved with the enemy and you gotta slaughter them. You have to slaughter them.
Right.
And eventually the democracy votes him down. But it's an interesting turning point in the democracy, in terms of the tragedy of democracy, the way that the history of Thucydides' history is like a Greek tragedy, the way that the democracy and its concepts turn against itself as it embraces being an empire, and therefore the violence as it's required to keep an empire, which is antithetical to the democracy they've kind of built.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this question of violence is very important. I mean, but again, I mean, as we think through the future, I mean, the question is, who's responsible for this too? You have to remember that, we opened tonight talking about Jean Cavalet and Albert Laudman, both of whom were assassinated, basically. Cold-blooded killing of great minds, right? We can go through countless others. We can go through this in terms of many repressive state apparatuses, in our contemporary times. And, ultimately, is some way a revolution, a settling of accounts. What does that really mean? What is really going to go on in terms of this settling of accounts? And, Jeremy brings up the whole Balibar thing and the Nouveau Philosophe. Is Badiou settling his philosophical consciousness too, right? Which is a great phrase of Marx. I settle my philosophical, consciousness here, settle accounts, right? With Proudhon, with others, etc. So in some ways we have here a historical repetition of, the 1830s, through up until the financial crisis and after of the 1857-58 period in the 19th century, of which Marx is responding to. And, the 18th Brumaire is interesting in this context too. How is the new Bonapartism, playing out today? The genius of Louis Napoleon, and Marx is the only one to really pick up on this, that they actually fuse with the lumpen proletariat, the rulers, right? They know how to get the lumpen proletariat in the mix, right? And the petit bourgeois, right? And in a way, very interesting the way this worked. And a classic text, one of the most brilliant things Marx wrote, in terms of historical repetition. First as tragedy, as farce. unfortunately, we need a new category. Pastiche isn't enough. We need new categories in order to understand where we are. I keep saying this, but I mean, to me, it's gone well beyond farce. I mean, you can replay everything from Highway 61 by Bob Dylan. The broken gamblers were bored and they put some bleachers in the sun. And yes, we do believe it can be done on Highway 61. And we're watching this like a Deborahn spectacle all the time, where we see this cast of characters. I mean, this looks like the Night of the Living Dead, these senators. You got Lindsey Graham in the tan suit talking to this woman who looks so repressed. Excuse me, I'm not trying to be, but I mean, she looks like a totally repressed, judge. You already see how she's going to vote just by the body language, the comportment, as the French say, as Merleau-Ponty, her comportment. You're seeing this, right? You're seeing this in Pence. Just think of Donald Trump. He gets reelected and he quotes. You're going to have First Lady, what's her name? Pence, the religious right, that Pence can't go in the room without her next to him. I mean, think about this, really. In a sense, what we're seeing here in this spectacle, this Deborahn nightmare, if you will, right? In some ways, the image is no longer a commodity; it's a horror show. Yeah, Bruno, go ahead. Yeah.
No. I wonder if you or anyone read the book, but you wrote a book on Trump, right? Called Trump.
No, I didn't read that one.
Oh, okay. No,
I mean, Sarkozy. I read the meaning of Sarkozy. Yeah. Going back to what Lydia said, sometimes philosophers are pretty good at the philosophical journalism. He wrote a book directly on Sarkozy's regime, right? The meaning of Sarkozy. Right?
Yeah, I think one of the latest one is called
Trump.
It's about Trump, and there is another one that I just got.
Okay, interesting.
The True Life.
The True Life?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so that's why you're bringing up the truth, yeah. Well, that's what eminence in truths, right? Yeah. Well, maybe next time I can do something on his truth procedures. I have, some knowledge of that. Maybe we can talk about his relationship to the truth. But
please. I had a question about that. Please do so next time.
Yeah. Okay. I will. I'll
do
that. And also, I want you to realize that in German, which is our philosophical language, there is a long debate about Plato's theory of truth, Wahrheit, as the Germans see it, right? And and then the Heideggerian turn to aletheia, right? And Heidegger actually writes a very long piece, a very dense piece on Plato's theory of the truth, right? On very interesting in another way. Despite his politics, Heidegger still taught us how to question, right? If we get anything from Heidegger, we learn the path of questionings, I think, in a way. It's very much fundamental in that sense, yeah, in many ways. So, it's like Ezra Pound. We can learn a lot from the writing of the cantos, right, in a lot of ways, even though he was a screaming, radio person for Mussolini, right? Always out there, yeah.
One of the cantos is that Ezra Pound is, the character is, in his real life, is when he's in an Italian jail with Emmett Till's father.
Wow.
Emmett Till's father is a character. I forgot one of the cantos is.
Okay. Yeah, that's worth looking up.
Gentleman, and they're in a jail in Italy.
Yeah, the Pisen cantos when he's literally, the Americans have put him in a cage.
Yeah.
Right.
There's an African American older dude, and that's Emmett Till's father.
Wow.
Right. Amazing. That's great. Yeah. So speaking of Ezra Pound, I had the privilege of having Hugh Kenner, the author of the Pound Era, as a teacher, and he told me the story many, many years ago of when he visited Pound. Pound was incarcerated in a mental institution, St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Yeah, at St. Elizabeth. And he said he would sit with Ezra Pound, and they would feed the pigeons peanuts, right, etc. And they would sit on a bench at St. Elizabeth, the mental institution in D.C. And anyway, Kenner said to me, I learned more in a half an hour in conversation than I did in 10 years of graduate study from Pound on poetry. So that gives you an idea of why the poet shouldn't be excluded, with all peace to Plato, in a way. But this is a tough story, this mimesis, right? And has a long history here. right? And also, I think we raised some very, very deep questions that require more and more thinking about, what is truth? What are truth procedures? The difference in the movement of presentation and representation. Is presentation actually possible, right? Is that kind of temporality possible? Or is it an impossibility of possibility? And again, this whole question of, why would one go back to rethink, a classical text in philosophy? A landmark, though, a landmark book, right, that's being rewritten in a way. I mean, does he think he's Joyce? He's going to rewrite Ulysses, he's going to rewrite the Odyssey one day in the life of Leopold Bloom in Dublin, right? And the consciousness of that cycle, which to me is the beginning of the end of liberal capitalism, by the way, if you read Joyce's Ulysses carefully. It's really the end of, that everyday life of Leopold Bloom. You read it carefully. But anyway, that's another story. And or Konstantzakis rewrites the Odyssey in Greece, right? A modern sequel, he calls it. So there are a lot of attempts to do this, as you know. It's not like but Alain Badiou is the first one to go back and do this. But yes, you're right. What is his motivation? Who are the characters representative of? What does it mean vis-a-vis all power of the imagination? Some of the debates of the 60s that go back to the 30s, back to 1915, and of course from really 1789 all the way till the beginning of social democracy and Frederick Engels, right? All of these things seem to be operative here, in terms of levels of argumentation, I mean, I remember, I'll leave it at this, when I met with Syriza, we were very fond, some of us here in New York, of the Syriza upsurge, the synopsismos. And we had people, we actually got Alexis Tsipras to come and give a talk before he was elected, not when he was president. Bruno, were you there? Jeremy, you went, right?
Yeah,
Tsipras, we went to dinner, right? We went to dinner. Yeah. We went to dinner on 37th Street. But anyway, all to say, we were very excited about this. So we would meet with Rina Deroux, for example, who was their main front person in the United States with the New York group of Syriza members. And we'd sit there. And, she would take copious notes. We would, there were a group of leftists that would grill her. What do you intend to do if you win? And et cetera, et cetera. And finally, she would say, we know all these arguments of the past. We're into something new, right? She says, I know that argument between Lenin and Trotsky, or Trotsky and Stalin, or I know these things, that have gone on the Greek left, etc. So in some ways, they were trying to step out into something new, something that was more reflective of the times. But of course, they were crushed by finance capital and by austerity. They were crushed. They didn't have a plan of how to work with this, etc. It split the Greek left terribly, right? And right now they're a minority party, right? The second party, but a minority party. They gave up power, and it's my understanding they're moving more and more to the center. So it goes to show you, the old Santayana dictum. Those who do not remember, who do not learn the lessons of the past or the lessons of history, are condemned to repeat it. So they put themselves in that position. They didn't learn the lessons, right? You don't give in to these people too much. And this is what I admire about Badiou. You don't give in, so much, right? I admire this about him, this notion of fidelity. I admire it. I'm not saying it's the answer, but I do admire it deeply.
In the case you just mentioned, Michael, about Syriza, I mean, the strangulation of austerity was so intense that how do you counter that?
No, it's a good point. I mean, there were plans to do that. That you would get out of the Eurozone. Of course, it would be a lot of pain to the people. But our good friend, we just did a nice little podcast with Konstantinos Tsoukalas. In some ways, his pension's been cut 65%. I mean, luckily he has a, well-to-do wife, and he's elderly and he's okay in terms of surviving. But these people were cut like crazy because of this. So I don't really think they had as much to lose as it would have been in terms of getting out of the Eurozone. It's a long discussion, but in a way, maybe Varoufakis in some ways may have been right. But this is another, this is a side discussion on these things. I think they just gave in too easily. I was there, by the way, after for the no vote and afterwards. They tried to interview me and they asked me who I was, and I said, "Oh, I'm a communist from New York City." Then they took away all the microphones and walked away, right? Because that's a bad word to the Greek media, communist. So anyway, it was kind of funny. I should have known better, but anyway. Anyway, maybe it was the New York City that really got to him. Oh boy, yeah. Anyway, who knows? But anyway, yeah. I mean, it's a good question. Yeah, what choices did they have? It's a good question. It's a good question for us too. Why isn't? I mean, look, we can ask the question again vis-a-vis this notion of communism and the strength and fidelity to May of '68, if you will. Why have students not mobilized against debt, right? Why, when I read you some statistic from 1969 to 1970 in terms of occupation of buildings, why isn't this happening? They're not getting any education. My students come in dumb and they go out dumber too. I mean, it's not their fault that they're dumb, but the schools are making them dumber. We've learned this from Stiegler and what Herbert Marcuse said. Education in America is the systematic moronization of its people. It's not everybody. We know that. I mean, some of us have struggled against that and not happened. But in a way, it's interesting. Why aren't people standing up? This to me seems to be the fundamental ethical question. Why do people desire, in some ways, their slavery and their security, right, over their freedom? This is really a fundamental, to me, ethical question going forward. We haven't really talked. We talked about epistemology and ontology tonight mostly, and, some of those things around that. But really the essential question to me in going forward, and I think this happens in terms of the singular and individuation as well. Why do people ultimately get caught up in what, Bruno and I have been thinking about and writing about a little bit, this kind of techniques of servitude? How do they play into this new psychological game, right, that has been inflicted upon them, to get to the point where they can't just wake up and say, I'm going to be paying back. The undergraduate average is $30,000 to get an education, the debt that they've included in the United States. I know it's not true in Australia or in Canada and other, English-speaking countries, but, here it's $30,000 is the average debt for the undergraduate. And how do they get themselves into a position they're going to pay back 75 to 80, right, with the interest and all of that, and there's no rebellion about this, right, in a way, right? And 90% of the jobs out there, I mean, if you really look at this, are really completely meaningless, right? In a sense. I mean, about alienated labor, again, there's no discussion about this. How people feel, are they satisfied, or their identity being shaped by what they do, right? In a sense, this is another question, right? So where is it? What has happened? To me. So again, I admire this this force, if you will, called Alain Badiou, that is able to say no, right, to the entire system, right, in a way, yeah, in many ways, and that the compromise isn't there. Whether or not the strategies are right or whatever, that remains to be seen. But again, it is an ethical position. It's a Socratic position. We will live the life of excellence. We will live the life of virtue rather than compromise with the state, right? Now, of course, he's well paid. He's got a lot of books, etc. It's not like this is a starving person, or Gramsci in prison, for that matter, right? Who writes the prison notebooks, the 100 notebooks, over 3,000 pages of reflections, etc. But at the same time, it's someone that's very uncompromised to my mind, And I admire this character in a sense, right? In a way, yeah. And I'm looking forward to reading the book on Trump. I can imagine, yeah. Although, I think we all could write the book on Trump, It's a huge target, right? It's like you can't miss with the darts when you throw them, or, yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, so I think that's very, very important. I think what's really been lost, and I think we've pointed to it tonight, and is worthy of more development, is the lack of intellectual curiosity. This whole thing of the dog, right, that Bruno brought up, and this lack of intellectual curiosity, and also the submission, right, to the status quo, is very important to confront where we are, right? And I think that's the task of writers, philosophers, to engage that, as well as artists, right, in a sense. We're not going to get that out of investigative reporting. I disagree with Chomsky. The more you know about the system, the more you're going to, be active. I think it's a very different kind of thing. Yeah. A lot of people, this is the second category. I think Richard left us, but it's the second category. Zizek loves this category. Instead of denial, it's disavowal. I know it, but, right? I know it, but, right? It's not like Socratic ignorance. It's the Freudian disavowal, the second stage. After you're in denial, you're really in disavowal. I know that, but, right? I know I should be doing this, but I won't, right? And I can't, or something like that. This category of disavowal. So this is another thing we really need to, I think, take into account as, we go forward. Yeah. So anyway, anybody want to say anything? Yeah.
No, I'm going.
You're going to dinner. I know it's your dinner hour. It's Italian time. The Greeks follow you. We're a little later. I haven't eaten either. The Greeks follow. Right. And for Beryl, it's after breakfast, and the rest of us, I guess, it's getting near some people maybe bedtime. I don't know, or reading time or study time. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.